And there we go. So good morning, welcome, welcome. Here you are, day 2 of the annual Northeast Regional Invasive Species and Climate Change Management Network Symposium. We're excited about today. Yesterday was wonderful. Today will also be wonderful. Just some reminders that we have set up this meeting not in webinar format, so you all can chat and talk with your fingers, as my mom says, to each other, but you'll want to keep your microphone muted. So that's something we can manage from here, but it's better if you manage it from there. And feel free to keep your video on or off. I think we want to remind everyone that, as you were just notified, we are recording this. And so if your video is on, you will be recorded. And we do have closed captioning options. So at the bottom of your screen, you should see a CC that can set you up for having your closed captions off or on. And just wanted to quickly show what we're going to be doing today. So here's our schedule for today. And you can see here I am talking to you for a few more minutes. I'm Tony Lynn Morelli. I'm a research ecologist with the USGS at the Northeast Climate Adaptation Science Center, and also a co-founder and co-lead of the RISCC network. And I'm also an alumnus of Michigan State. So I just wanted to kind of take a moment to put out some thoughts for the family of Alexandria Werner, Brian Fraser, and Ariel Anderson, whose names were released this morning. My nephew goes to Michigan State. I went to Michigan State, and it now just joins a long list of places that our kids can't be safe in our country. And hopefully, in addition to all the great conservation work we're doing as a community, we also can figure out how to put some energy into making a change there too. Okay, we are going to have another packed several hours, starting with a workshop on culturally important species, super exciting lessons in Wabanakik. And then we'll have a lunch break. We'll actually have a real lunch break where you can chew and not have people watching you. So maybe that'll be a nice change in your day, or maybe that's how you normally eat. We'll then have a presentation session on forest invasives and climate change, followed by a panel session on managed relocation, quick break, and then some lightning talks from the community here. And within our leadership and research team at the Northeast RISCC, we're excited to share what we've been doing over the last year. Finally, Jenica will close us out. So with that, I'm going to hand things over to Marissa Weiss. And Marissa Weiss is the climate engagement scientist at the Northeast Climate Adaptation Science Center. She will be moderating the next session. So with that, we're happy to have you here. Thanks, Marissa.
Thanks, Tony Lynn, and welcome everyone. I'm pleased to introduce our first session today. The title of the session is Culturally Important Species, Lessons in Protecting Brown Ash in Wabanakik. This session will be discussing insights learned from a cross-cultural collaboration to protect brown ash. The topics will include the cultural importance of brown ash, current research on managing brown ash in the face of an invasive species threat, the importance of seed collection, and in particular, the insights that come from this cross-cultural collaboration that the team who's leading the presentation will be describing. There will also be time for discussion at the end of the presentation. And so do keep listen for questions, and those can be shared in the chat at any time, and also at the end of the presentation, there will be a chance to also raise your hand. So I'm very pleased to introduce our speakers today, John Daigle, Tyler Everett, Emily Francis, and Ella McDonald, all from the University of Maine, and I'll hand it over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Marissa, for that introduction, and thank you, Tony. for the acknowledgement. Very important. And yeah, so I'm very excited to present today, and I got to sit in on some of the sessions yesterday. And I'm pretty excited just to maybe become more engaged with this community and with our work, and hopefully we can benefit with all the work that's kind of being done, and certainly with the work that we have plans for and that we're going to be presenting today. If you have thoughts, ideas for improvement or other ideas, we would welcome them, but it's nice to be part of this community. So the plan for our session is to kind of do a joint presentation. I'm going to lead off the presentation, and then I'm going to have my 3 graduate students also present on some of their work, and then come back to me, and we purposefully left some time in for some questions and some discussion too related to our efforts. And so I'm hoping that we'll have some good questions from the audience. The slide here, I just wanted to just indicate too, with the Ash Protection Collaborative across Wabanakik, it's something that we're developing a website. We'll get into that more, but it'll be a resource with some of our efforts coming forth. So, and we'll get to that in our presentation as well. So sorry, Tyler, if you want to go to the next slide. So at the center of our work really is focusing on a particular species of ash tree, the brown or black ash, Fraxus nigra. It's black ash, but oftentimes here in Maine, especially within the Wabanakik community and basket making community, it's often referred to as brown ash, but basically it's the same species. And brown ash is, I hope you'll learn today, is an extremely important species. It's a species that really hasn't had a lot of research around it. It tends to grow in wetlands areas. So from a forestry industry standpoint, hasn't received a lot of interest because of, it's hard to get to. The economic value, is not there where it kind of received a lot of research attention. It does tend to kind of grow in these wetland environments where it's difficult to get to, as a lot of our basket tree harvesters indicate. They look for those basket quality trees where it is in that wetland environment. It likes to keep its feet wet, the roots. That really kind of creates a tree that is very special for basket making. Here in the New England area and Maine, it tends to be very sporadic. It's an understory tree for the most part. It's really sporadic in the forest. It's unlike areas, say, in the Midwest, like around Michigan and Wisconsin, where you might have, stands of ash, black ash trees. But here in the Northeast, it tends to be an understory tree and kind of appears sporadically in the forest. Okay, next slide. And one of the things that, because it hasn't received a lot of attention, at least from a research perspective, is kind of illustrating some of the significance of brown ash trees and kind of the growing research now that's been focused on ash trees, especially now with the emerald ash borer, where more research has been done on various ash species, and more work is being done with the brown ash tree, which is very encouraging too. I'd like to talk about the significance in a couple different ways. One is the cultural significance of brown ash trees, and also the ecological significance of brown ash trees. And brown ash trees, while I just mentioned it wasn't an economically important tree species from a forest industry standpoint, it has always been a tree of cultural significance, and there's also been important economic ties. I grew up in a family where my grandparents were basket makers. I'm a citizen member of the Penobscot Nation, and the economic importance of those baskets cannot be underestimated. A lot of the baskets were sold to tourists that came to our state of Maine, and for other basket makers, it's really important. In fact, it's one of the oldest art traditions here in New England, because it's been a valued resource in that sense, just because they're just beautiful and functional. The other part of this is just the role that the tree plays in the culture. Like a lot of indigenous cultures around the world, there's real strong connections to natural features of that landscape. And the brown ash tree certainly, it plays that role. It actually is tied to the creation story of Wabanakik tribes here in Maine, where Gluskop shot an arrow into the basket tree or brown ash tree, and out of the tree came the people singing and dancing. So that creation story, the importance of that tree really kind of shows that identity of who we are as a people. So the cultural significance is very important. The other part is the ecological significance. And again, because it is a wetland type tree, the role that it plays in hydrology is very important. But again, more research is also showing just the uniqueness of the tree in terms of its niche that it plays. These ash trees tend to leaf out later in the spring compared to the other surrounding trees in its environment. So that allows sunlight to get down to the forest floor, where you have, more vegetation growth occurring on the forest floor. And vice versa, the leaves tend to fall off earlier in the fall than the other trees. And there's the leaves tend to decompose quicker than the other leaves. And again, it adds more nutrients to that forest floor environment and nutrients to the vegetation. So kind of that unique niche environment, both for flora and fauna, also makes the ash tree of ecological significance. And again, talking with some of the ash tree harvesters, again, not knowing the plant species that grow around these ash trees, the medicinal plants. So both the cultural ecological significance is really important as we think about brown ash trees. Tyler, next slide. So, you're starting to understand kind of the significance of the tree. I think it kind of naturally flows into thinking about the threat to these ash trees, the emerald ash borer. And I think most of you in the audience are probably familiar with the emerald ash borer here in North America. I was pleasantly surprised actually yesterday seeing some of the audience being as far away as Hawaii. So for those that may not have heard about the emerald ash borer, it is a pretty devastating invasive insect, where it was first detected in Michigan and has really spread basically throughout all of the native range of ash trees, which the emerald ash borer impacts all native ash trees. And in some cases, it has the effect of nearly killing all the ash trees where those emerald ash borer exist, where you might have nearly 100% mortality where ash trees are growing. And more research is showing that probably within the next decade and a half, it's probably going to have spread throughout the natural range of all of our ash trees here in North America. So really, it's imperative that more work be done and efforts be focused around the emerald ash borer and what we want to try to accomplish before it gets to those places where it has not yet impacted, which fortunately here in Maine, most of our ash trees are still alive. It's in small pockets here in our state. And with it being first detected in 2018, it's really generated a lot of interest and motivation for looking at ways of dealing with emerald ash borer and thinking of strategies of how we might be able to try to retain ash in as a component of our forests. Next slide. So what I'd like to do is just kind of transition. I want you to see some of the work of the great work my graduate students are involved with, and with Tyler Everett with his work, and Emily Francis, and my newer student, Ella McDonald. And before we get into their work, I just wanted to show some of the tribal nation partners that have been part of our work for many years now. We mentioned the Wabanakik, but this is basically a confederation of some of the tribal nations here in our state, the Mi'kmaq, Houlton-Banner Maliseet Indians, Passamaquoddy, and Penobscot Nation. They have all been really critical partners in our work to learn more about the brown ash species, what constitutes kind of basket quality trees and the environment that's important for those trees. They've really been very strong partners. Not included on this list here are other partners such as the Maine Indian Basket Makers Alliance, which a lot of the tribal members in each of these tribes belong to Basket Maker Alliance. And a lot of those members have been part of our meetings over the years, very involved in some of our work. And also tribal partners outside of Maine, Akwesasne, and some of my students who have met with Les Benedict and other tribal partners, critical people who have been part of our work. And hopefully you'll start to see some of the collaboration that's happening also among some of the tribal partners as we move forward. And I'm going to hand it off to Tyler with some of his work that he's done with some of the tribal partners and other partners. So Tyler, you want to take the stage?
Awesome. Thank you, John. Basul Wabanakik, Mi'kmaq Ak Talawisi, Tyler Everett. Greetings. I'm a person of the dawn. I'm Mi'kmaq, and my name is Tyler Everett. I'm a graduate student in the APCA lab, or the Ash Protection Collaboration across Wabanakik. So it's a mouthful, but we really like our name and the meaning behind it, which is going to be on our webpage. So once our webpage is live, Ella will share that. Not to steal some of Ella's thunder when she gets on the camera here. But just to start, I wanted to go over the hats that I wear, the different hats I wear. I think, I have the researcher hat here at the University of Maine, but much of what I do is dictated by the other hats that I've worn and I wear. And so I've been a part-time forester with the Passamaquoddy Forestry Department for a long time, since 2015, and then also the Forest Adaptation Technical Assistant with USET, or United South and Eastern Tribes, a tribal nonprofit. And there I work on climate adaptation planning in the forested setting with our member tribal nations. But back to my Passamaquoddy hat, that's really where a lot of this kicked off, my kind of journey into emerald ash borer and ash response, or ash management response. I was working at the time, my supervisor was Ernie Neptune, and we would, talk a lot about my plans moving forward. I'd let him know as I was finishing up my undergraduate degree that I had plans to maybe go back and do a graduate degree. And because I'd been working with the tribe for a while, he thought it would be great if he could influence me to do a project that would be beneficial to the department. And I was very much on board because it's very fulfilling work to work directly with a partner like that in a tribal nation, being a tribal citizen myself. And so I talked about a couple different projects, but what we decided on was emerald ash borer. But that got my, the gears turning. I didn't really know exactly what I wanted to do. So you fast forward to the fall of my first semester as a master's student, and Ernie sent me a text message and he wanted me to join this brown ash task force meeting. And a lot of the work that John just touched on has really been integrated or woven into the brown ash task force work since the very beginning, which was before emerald ash borer even arrived. And so I was able to sit in on that meeting and not necessarily share my thoughts or my ideas, but just listen. So I listened to tribal leaders, tribal natural resource staff, engaging with state and federal agencies and university researchers, all on this forest health issue of emerald ash borer and its impact to this culturally significant brown ash tree and the forests they occupy. So I took a lot away from that, but I did see a need highlighted in that meeting, which was, we need to know how much and where the ash resource is on tribal land in order to respond. And so in my master's program, I developed an inventory protocol. And here in these pictures are a lot of our tribal partners coming to the university to attend one of these inventory workshops. So using that protocol, I developed the inventory ash forest to get a suite of data that kind of gives you the the ability to turn toward a particular management route for that ash wetland in response to emerald ash borer. And of course, because that was the kind of focus of the inventory, a lot of the discussions we had out there with tribal natural resource staff and basket makers was, well, what do we do now if we want to manage for emerald ash borer? And I didn't put forth any management recommendations in that work because it's a culturally significant species. And so, again, I had to get back to the community once more. And that's a big part of my work that I really enjoy. It's tribal led. I work with the community to decide the research design, the questions that should be answered, because if it's not tribal led, why would they adopt it at the end, whatever product we produce from our research? With that comes concerns of data sovereignty. So because we work so closely with tribal nations, we want to make sure that the data that we garner through our research is the property of the tribal nation. It's their intellectual property. They can do with it what they want to do in their community. And anytime that we want to move forward with publishing aspects of that, we have to talk to the forestry department. And then if they say we have to bring this to council, then that's the pathway we go through, because it's their data. And so data sovereignty is a big part of all aspects of our work, and some of the other parts of today's talk will touch on that. The community and tribal youth have all come together to build our knowledge base and how we want to respond to emerald ash borer on tribal land. And an awesome partnership that my work has been a part of has been with the Wabanakik Youth in Science Program, or the WAYS program. So tribal nations and indigenous communities really place a high value on incorporating tribal youth. Because brown ash is so culturally significant, the relationships with this tree can be passed on through basketry and harvesting of ash trees, but it also can be passed on through projects like this, inventory of ash stands. And so for this reason, a partnership with a tribal youth group like WAYS just happened organically. So I've held several programs and trainings with the WAYS program to kind of get them acquainted with this. And the youth in that program and the leadership there kind of taken it and run with it and done their own thing. And they're on tribal lands for other tribal partners in this project, doing inventory for the forestry department and helping them garner this information without having issues of capacity, right? I mean, everyone has so much going on. To get into the forest and do a really impressive inventory of ash forests is a challenge to juggle with all your other responsibilities. We also have an internship position open for a WAYS student to be a part of some of my upcoming and current work. So listening to the community, as I kind of harped on all this whole time, is a big part of our project and how it maintains that tribal-led kind of initiative. And so as we work collaboratively here in the Northeast, a common concern for ash is that emerald ash borer is not the only threat. The St. Regis Mohawk tribe that we partner with in Akwesasne has incorporated considerable efforts to monitor ash health and the condition of their ecosystems into their efforts to monitor for emerald ash borer. The basket makers here in the Dawnland were foundational to founding the Brown Ash Task Force because they were concerned of dieback in ash in the area before emerald ash borer is here. And when we know emerald ash borer is not the threat, we can rule that out. We know that there's something else that's impacting these trees. And a lot of our research partners and collaborators have also pointed out that climate projections are showing that this tree species is going to migrate northward and then also upward in elevation. And so these are areas of climate refugia where in the future of this work, if we have genetic material to rematriate the species when this interaction between emerald ash borer and these ash trees is a bit more sustained, we're going to need to know where those sites are, in those sites that are adapted to future climate situations. And the only way to do that is if we're working collaboratively right now to identify where ash is growing on the landscape today. And so that's a big part of our work, is to identify these sites and get in there and collect the data that we can now while these trees are still on the landscape. And so one of these is the kind of the focus of my work right now. So we're working with our tribal nation partners to develop a research design aligned with tribal nation priorities. And with that in motion, we can carry out a series of management trials at 6 brown ash wetland forest sites across the state. There's 3 in the northern part of the state, and our thoughts there were to center the management trial around an area with active emerald ash borer infestations very nearby, or actually in that particular stand. And then there's 3 in the central part of the state. And there we were thinking we would be distanced from the emerald ash borer infestation. But then shortly after we identified those sites, there was a detection in Waterville. So you can see in that southern part of the state, that's red circle, there's a detection now and there. But this really kind of gives a sense of realism to the project, right? You never know when a detection will pop up for emerald ash borer because human transport of the pest is such a big threat. At these sites, we're going to test tribal supported integrated pest management strategies. This will likely include a combination of silviculture, and so harvesting ash trees to increase the site's tolerance to the impacts of emerald ash borer, biological controls, the release of parasitoid wasps that prey on emerald ash borer, as well as the injection of a systemic insecticide treatment. And so this is really expensive, the insecticide treatment. It's not common in the forested setting yet, but we're going to try to test that, and others are as well. And for this reason, we're going to target certain mature overstory seed-bearing trees for this injection. This will help reserve another practice at these sites, which is the collection of ash seed. This is something Emily is helping coordinate among our partners. So I'm going to pass it off to Emily now.
Thank you, Tyler. My name is Emily Francis, and I'm a PhD candidate working in this lab with both Tyler, Ella, and Dr. Daigle. I'd like to say I'm not Wabanakik or Indigenous, so my views come from an immigrant background and everything that goes with that. So Tyler and Dr. Daigle talked about the importance of brown ash for the Wabanakik people and its importance to the habitat it's found in. However, ash as a whole is very important to the state of Maine. White and green ash are typically timber trees with value for baseball bats, cabinetry, and wood veneers. And they're also the 2 types that are most common for street trees and nursery stock. Most likely what you're going to find in your backyard for landscaping. One study that came out about 10 years ago estimated that the removal of urban ash in Maine would be between 500,000 to 800,000 trees of green and white ash, and could cost up to $381 million to remove just for the state of Maine. But brown ash is a little bit more elusive and protected in brown ash swamps, so it makes it difficult. They are difficult to access for timber, but they're still found on some residential properties throughout the state, especially where Maine is such a rural state, and we don't have the suburban sprawls seen in other areas. Therefore, not only are white and green ash timber species, but they're also very important to the aesthetic of municipalities and residences all over Maine. But we specifically are working with brown ash, but I did want to highlight the importance of the other 2 species of ash that are also found in Maine. So why harvest seed? With the EAB threat bearing down on the state from both the north and the south, there's a limited window that exists to collect genetic seed material that's being produced naturally by trees that are on the landscape now. And ash typically produces seeds every 3 to 8 years, meaning that it's pretty much a race to identify wild ash stands to collect seeds from. So Tyler did a really great overview over his research and the inventory identification protocol that he's worked on. So we're really looking to find wild ash to collect from, because when we harvest the seed, The seed can be used in research and conservation methods, from genetic studies, future plantings, regeneration of trees, but also for safekeeping and seed banks, which I'm sure people have heard of on a large scale, from different programs that are quite popular. And really the goal of collecting seed is to provide those who are invested in protecting this tree species a way to improve the current effort to get involved with the current effort, and they can collect ash seed. So if you'd like to go to the next slide, Tyler. So we have ash seed collection in action. There's been a call from the community who are concerned about EAB in Maine with the threat to brown ash, which has been heavily driven by Wabanakik basket makers. And from this, our team has been involved in learning about seed collection, ash seed collection, and the process to store seed for long-term uses. And while our focus is primarily on brown ash, all ash seed collection is important, and the process of collecting for each species is the same. You just need to be able to identify which species you're actually collecting from. So the picture on the left is of Tyler and myself with Tom Newell from the Passamaquoddy Forestry Department and McKay Burley from the St. Regis Mohawk Tribal Nursery Program during a seed collection workshop in Akwesasne, New York this past summer, where we were able to collect with Les Benedict and others from the Natural Resource Department with the St. Regis Mohawk tribe, who are leaders in ash seed collection, propagation, and rematriation. And then in the center photo, we have a picture of one of the ash seed kits. Part of this process in understanding and learning about ash seed collection has been to create a list of items necessary to collect seed for the year-round efforts with spring scouting and fall collecting of seed. So that's just an example of one of our kits. And then the picture on the far right is of brown ash seeds that we were able to collect in New York this past summer. Next slide. So what this culminates to is the creation of a seed collection document. We've been really guided by the basket making community and others who are really interested in being able to collect seed. And there's been a call for action on how to do this, the process, how to store seeds. And what we really found was that in researching how to collect seed, it became really clear that most of the available instructive publications were directed to scientific or industry professionals rather than landowner, basket makers, citizen scientists. So we've wanted to create a document that's for the non-researcher. So what's come out of this is a document that's focused on breaking down the technical jargon and the process to submit seed to federal facilities. And also what we will eventually be working on at the University of Maine is a seed storage location that will potentially be for the tribes or to help the tribes in Maine, but also just to generally collect seed in Maine as well. And so the review process at this point, we do have a document that is ready for public review. It's been reviewed internally by our own team, by members of U.S. Forest Service, the Maine State Forest Service, Wild Seed Project, tribal basket makers, and ash harvesters. And we will be pilot testing this document at our seed collection trainings later this year. And once our APCA website is live, the most recent document will be available there. What's really important about this document is that it's a living document, which means that regardless of who is part of the research team, somebody will always have access to update this document as information changes and improves and our process updates. So we'll have more information going forward. Okay, thanks.
Thanks, Emily, for talking a bit about the importance of seed collection, and for Tyler for talking about all his great work to create an inventory process. I'm going to talk a bit more about the details of how we're really going to push all this work out and involve especially non-tribal organizations to get involved in the work of protecting ash. And first, I'll give a little bit of context. My name is Ella McDonald. I'm a person of settler descent like Emily, but I'm living on Penobscot land in Old Town, Maine. And I'm newly working towards my master's with John Daigle at UMaine Orono. But in my previous work, I was involved as program manager of First Light, which is an effort to really raise awareness about the history of colonization in Maine within conservation organizations and build relationships that can facilitate Wabanakik access to land as well as land returns. And that was a really successful effort. Over 60 conservation organizations are involved, and as well as state and federal agencies, and it's growing a lot as well. You can see a picture of one of our gatherings at the bottom of the slide there. And it was through First Light that I met John, who, in addition to being a professor at UMaine, is also a serving member of the Wabanakik Commission on Land and Stewardship, which is a group of 10 tribally appointed folks from each of the 5 tribes in Maine who put their heads together to really think through what Wabanakik priorities around land are. And a lot of the conservation organizations that are in First Light take a lot of direction from the Wabanakik Commission on all matters related to their priorities and Wabanakik engagement. And it was through this that conservation organizations really started thinking about how to protect culturally important species like brown ash, and also grant access to Wabanakik harvesters. And last year, just within the First Light Network, we actually had 27 conservation organizations across the state pledge over 600 staff hours and 1,500 volunteer hours to carry out a really extensive monitoring and seed collection effort through ash. So now we really have to create the infrastructure to train those organizations and make and share a bunch of the things that we've been learning, and spread the word about ash protection. And I'm sure you've heard the saying, many hands make the work easier, which I believe is very true for this work. And my role is focused on developing strategies, both communication and organizing that can mobilize people to join this work. And we hope to reach as many audiences across Wabanakik as possible. You may not have heard that term, but it's a word in Wabanakik languages that has a bunch of different meanings, but the one that we're using it as is in the location of the people of the dawn, which is wider than just the borders of Maine. Oh, Tyler, can you go back? And you can see the map up in the upper left, that Wabanakik incorporates parts of Canada as well as New Hampshire. So we're really hoping to expand our partnerships in those areas too. And we already have partners from all over the region, as I talked about, conservation organizations like MLTN, Maine Land Trust Network, as well as seed saving organizations like the Wild Seed Project, the Forest Service, and Maine Indian Basket Makers Alliance. And Tyler, you can flip to the next slide. And so to facilitate a lot of the learning that needs to happen, we're creating really 2 main avenues for sharing. The first is a website, and this is really, we're creating this at the request of tribal partners to share guidance and findings about ash management. And you can see a preview of the website here. And one thing that's really exciting about this is that no existing website that talks about ash centers it around Wabanakik perspectives, and has really multiple pages about Wabanakik perspectives on ash. So we're really hoping to center that on our website, as well as undergoing like a process of checking in and involving Wabanakik people from the very beginning in the creation of these tools. But we're also going through a closed process to develop it with state partners and nonprofit partners. And as if you try to navigate to the URL on the page, you can tell that it's not live yet, but it will be live in early March once it goes through this process of review. And we hope that you all will be visitors of that site. It will also be on that website, we'll be sharing a tool where anybody can report a sighting of ash, and that will make it really easy for our research team to locate sites for seed collection. And this needs to be really thoughtfully thought through with tribal partners with a lens that considers data sovereignty, given that knowledge of where basket quality trees are is held really closely within Wabanaki communities. And we also, in addition to that mapping process, plan to create a GIS map, which shows where seed has been collected and where it still needs to be collected. We're hoping to get as much geographical diversity as possible. And in addition to the website, we're also creating a workshop series. And this will have about 10 to 12 events, and it will cover everything from inventory to seed collection, and then to processing and storing seed and regenerating ash. And if you're interested in learning more or joining in and hearing more of the specifics, you can use this QR code up on the slide to register for our first event, which will be March 6th from 1 to 2. And we'll introduce you to key organizers, to basket makers, and talk about the upcoming program. And we hope to have folks participate from Canada, from New Hampshire, anywhere across the Northeast that's within Wabanakik, or even outside if you're interested. And Tyler, you can go to the next slide. So we acknowledge that it's necessary to create a broader collaboration to protect the future of brown ash in the Dawnland. And as we move through this work, we have 3 main goals for our collaboration. The first one has already been touched on a lot, but it's ensuring that our actions align with Wabanaki priorities and worldviews. Our goals of APCA shift all the time with feedback from Wabanaki, and our research methodology and website creation process constantly engages in check-ins with tribal partners to make sure that we're not falling out of line with what's most needed. The second is to engage new audiences of people who haven't really understood the value of brown ash before. And this involves a lot of what John talked about, educating people about the ecological and cultural roles of ash and providing easy ways to get them involved in finding ash and doing seed collection. And the third goal of our collaboration is really to create new possibilities through relationships for basket makers to access ash on conserved land. You can see to the right, this is a map of all the conserved land in Maine. And for some context, Wabanaki people previously had access to all of the land in Maine before colonization. And now 94% of land in Maine is privately owned. And the only way for basket makers to access that land is through permission from the landowner. And as ash trees are becoming increasingly threatened by EAB and climate change, which is worsening EAB infestations and causing ash to migrate north, harvesters will face more and more challenges in accessing this ash and making baskets. And conservation organizations, because they steward 23% of the land in Maine, have a great opportunity to share ash. And some organizations like the Appalachian Mountain Club and Down East Lakes Land Trust are already exploring some permitting processes with the tribes to allow harvesters to access ash. But we hope through our research to check in and sort of make sure that these tools are working throughout the networks that we're already involved in. And then we also hope that our efforts to collect information with land trusts about where ash is can be of benefit to Wabanaki harvesters. So we hope to share the location of ash with them if with the consent of land trusts, that they can build a relationship with harvesters. So we see ourselves as a bridge builder as well. That's all that I have to share. Pass it over to John.
Great. Thank you, Tyler, Emily, and Ella for doing such a great job explaining some of your work. And I'm going to just show just a few more slides because, again, like I had mentioned, we want to have time for some questions and some discussion, around our work. I've seen some great comments in the chat room, and hopefully we can kind of continue those things. I just wanted to share too, just, with the work that we do. I've been involved in this work for almost a decade now, and just some of the things that I've observed, through that time is, the real value of partnerships and collaboration. And, my background is more of a social scientist, so I rely on others like yourself here in the audience with more of the biological forestry background. But I am really amazed looking at it from a social science perspective, because a lot of this work initiated here in Maine really kind of came from some of the tribal community efforts. My grandparents, I think I mentioned, were basket makers, so I was kind of connected to the basket making community here in Maine. And they reached out to me to see about research because they had been contacted by basket makers in Michigan talking about this emerald ash borer killing basket trees. And so that communication amongst the basket makers initiated work here at the University of Maine, and some of our future work. And as Tyler mentioned, efforts that had been done with basket makers and being concerned about the brown ash health. Folks on the landscape seeing the health of the ash trees is just amazing. And talking about a long-term commitment, I've been involved with this for decades, but the folks here like Richard Silliboy, who was involved in the brown ash health work before EAB was even entered into the US. They just have a long-standing relationship to the resource and can see changes in those resource conditions, which is invaluable. And so, again, with this being kind of a long-term project, what I really like too with what Tyler has as part of his research program is the involvement of youth, because with continuing research and looking at the responses of research and other things, it's going to take time to see how we respond and how we can continue to adapt to a diminishing ash resource. Part of our work here in Maine, as a result of things that were happening in Michigan, when ash was dying and access became an issue, it became really hard for basket makers gaining access to private land for ash. That informed us we need to reach out to more of the private landowners in our efforts around access and potential management response to EAB because of the role of private landowners. And so fortunately, I think we're making some really good ground here in Maine with the conservation community, but also other private landowners, including forest industry. Next slide, Tyler. The other interesting thing, again, even though it is scary, and I think it's going to be even more devastating to see more of our ash trees here in Maine dying as a result of EAB. Through that, it really has bonded and reconnected a lot of tribal nations and here in the Northeast and the Midwest, because the ash trees are just a culturally significant tree species. It has been kind of like Les Benedict here talks about, has been a mechanism for reestablishing tribe-to-tribe relationships where we're kind of working together, trying to find solutions, working with same partners like the US Forest Service, state agencies working together, universities kind of coming together. So it is kind of been a mechanism for developing relationships and trying to find solutions as we go forward. Next slide, Tyler. And the other thing I've noticed, since I have been working on this for quite a few years, is that even though we're, it's evident that we're going to have EIB pretty much covering the whole expansive range of our native ash species here in North America in a very few short years, there's still a growing community of interest and research effort around understanding EIB and management responses, and interest in trying to find solutions where we might be able to try to retain ash as a component of our forest environment. And this includes, researchers from different universities, colloquium that are specifically being organized around brown ash, like we had here in Maine several years ago, Vermont a few years ago. We're going to have another colloquium here next year that we're planning on the latest research that's done and efforts that's being done around preserving ash in our forests. Next slide. And this is just a slide. It doesn't show all the growing partners, but I do, I hope that this list continues to grow. But again, we really have a kind of a growing collaboration, particularly in the next few years, with work with the University of Vermont and Penn State, along with our efforts working together, especially around inventory collection of ash seed. Genetic material with Penn State. We're going to be sharing resources and data that that we're collecting. So again, I really see some positive movement with some of the efforts compared to just a few years ago, which is very encouraging. And the final slide, Tyler. Willie Wan, I want to thank you. This is a slide of a trip that we made on some land that's owned by the Nature Conservancy here in Maine. Richard Sillaboy is in this picture. Emily, TNC staff, and some other tribal folks where we looked at this site where we were checking out a brown ash stand in central Maine, see if there was basket quality trees at this particular location. But it just kind of goes back to the interest of some of the conservation groups inviting us, wanting to kind of work together. And I think hopefully that will continue to grow throughout this year when we start to have our workshops and our research efforts and seed collection efforts in the coming years. So Willie Wan, thank you very much. And I think now if we want to go to questions, I think that'd be a good time. So Marissa, I think you were going to help us with that.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, John. And I think the rest of the participating audience will join me in thanking you. Thanking all of you, the presenters, for a very engaging and very informative talk, and for situating ash in cultural, ecological space and in connection to people. There's a very active discussion happening in the chat. There's gratitude being expressed in the chat. There's inquiries about connecting. And so we can save the chat and provide those email addresses. There's also a couple of questions about management and a question about basket making. So perhaps we can start with some questions about management. There's a question about what will be done with the seeds. How will the seeds be propagated, or will they be propagated?
Sure, I can touch on that. There are a couple different groups that we're working with. Some of the seed is going to be sent to the Ash Germplasm Research Center, which is in Ames, Iowa. There's another long-term storage facility. These are all with the USDA Forest Service in the US. USDA. And some of those seeds will be available for different genetic research projects for anybody who's interested in doing research and requesting from the federal repository. We at the University of Maine are working to, at some point, have some sort of nursery program and a seed storage program. We're also working with the different partners that we have across the state who are interested in saving seed, either for their own purposes or for the tribes. So working to create that capacity in Maine. There's a pretty strong program, I can't think of which agency necessarily runs it, it must be the USDA, of creating tribal nurseries in the US. So the St. Regis Mohawk tribe has a tribal nursery that they created within the last 4 years. So that's also a possibility. So at this point, we're really just looking, because EAB is such a threat, and every time trees produce seed, it's important to collect what we can. At this point, we're really just trying to collect and save as much as we can for whatever avenues the seed can be used for in the future. And yeah, that's kind of where we're going at this point. We're really hoping to be able to plant and rematriate seed later, but actual trees later. But there will definitely, and Tyler can speak to this a little more, there's a little specifics on how to do that with EAB coming in and how young a tree can be before EAB can infest it and all that sort of thing. So there's a lot of moving pieces to that question.
Thank you. Thank you. And continuing on this theme of preserving ash, there was a request for information about stump grafting resistant trees onto stumps. Wondering if that is how that research is going.
A lot of the genetic research is being led by Jennifer Cook, and some really exciting stuff being done. And most of what, or the most successful way of creating clones of ash is through grafting and root grafting. There are some field experiments ongoing as well in that realm, but Jennifer is really excited about brown ash in particular, because it does have a very strong response to emerald ash borer. And in fact, a lot of EAB larvae die in brown ash trees because of the stress response that brown ash has. It's just so significant that it actually causes more damage to the tree in the long run. It just kind of overreacts, if you will, to the impact, and eventually does succumb to emerald ash borer. But because its genetic code is so similar to Manchurian ash, which is an ash species native to emerald ash borer's range, some of those genetic codes or sequences would point to it having the same characteristics that are exciting for brown ash to have here in the US, and maybe offers the opportunity to do some back crosses to get something very similar to what we have for native brown ash, but has the same characteristics that Manchurian ash has. And so it's a very exciting area of research right now.
Thank you. And one more on the preservation of ash research and tools theme. What is most effective, the biological control, saving seeds from resistant trees, the chemical treatment, or other?
I think that a combination of them is good. I saw you unmuted, John. Did you want to touch on something?
Oh, no, I think the key here is kind of the examination of a combination of efforts. I think that's the ideal, that, you know, perhaps in the future, not needing to have a chemical treatment once, you know, you have natural predators and other kind of elements kind of keeping EAB in check, as well as the development of trees that might be more resistant to EAB that could be repopulated in those places. But initially, and again, this is where I think some exciting work is going to be done, but we still have to see the efficacy of that work. But the combination of different strategies combined together, I think, holds the most promising future. But Tyler, you can add more to that if you want.
I'll just add that I think an example of that combining different strategies would be the biological controls in silviculture. So if we don't do anything to these stands, trees that are dying because of emerald ash borer or some other stress-induced variable, those trees that die will call emerald ash borer to the site. And so then you have a boost in the emerald ash borer population at that site. And you might see the site get impacted as a whole much sooner than if you did some intermediate treatments to kind of maintain a site that's most tolerant of emerald ash borer. If we do that, what it does is it buys time. And so you could buy time for, say, these biological controls that are being released to actually become established. And once they're established, the goal there is that the interaction between the biocontrol, emerald ash borer, and these ash trees can be sustained, and they all can be on the landscape in the future. And the only way to do that is we have the time for these biological controls to become established. So a great example of them kind of working in tune. And then you could throw another variable. If you injected trees with insecticide, those would be the seed source to keep that perpetually going.
Thank you. And there's a couple of questions in the chat about basket making that I think it might make sense to perhaps ask together. What is the impact of basket making on an infested tree? Like, are infested trees or dead trees used in basket making? And also, can a chemically treated tree be used in basket making?
Yeah, it's not recommended that, some of the chemical treated trees be used, for basket making. Again, like Tyler mentioned, the strategy there is to treat those trees that you would maintain a live seed source for that environment. And again, if, with the half-life of these pesticide treatments, theoretically you might be able to use that tree, but it'd be years away before you'd probably make any recommendation for using it for basket making purposes. Some of the trees that have been impacted, like in Michigan, some of the basket makers have utilized, kind of, it looks different, they still utilize some of the material with the trees that are dying or have been partly affected by the emerald ash borer. So some of it can still be used when you have EAB in the air before the trees die. Tyler, did you want to, or Emily, others want to add anything?
I think that there's a small window of opportunity there when a tree becomes impacted, especially for brown ash, because it gets, when it responds to emerald ash borer, it's a short window of time before it fully succumbs to emerald ash borer. And then once it's dead, rot, fungal infestations will stain the splint material. It's an awful lot of work to produce an ash splint. And so to go through that and not get a quality material that would make for usable material is not something most basket makers are going to do. Of course, as it becomes more scarce, maybe that's something to consider more often. And who knows, maybe it'll make for really beautiful baskets. I know Angelo Johnson with the St. Regis Mohawk tribe has pounded and made some baskets with material that had some of the EAB galleries visible in the splints. So that's pretty cool, but also sad at the same time.
It looks like Colleen, we actually have one of our main partner experts on, and it looks, Colleen, you had raised your hand. Did you want to make a comment?
I was just going to talk to the breeding program just from, but you guys sort of covered that. But I was just at a invasive species forum, and the research that they're doing there, is really encouraging. They're finding that if they breed two of the lingering ash, their offspring is more resistant than either of those two, and they're finding resistance levels that are the same as Manchurian ash already, which is remarkably fast, I think, for a breeding program. And yes, they are also grafting as you know, those generations, those like F1 and F2 generations, they are grafting those onto stumps of ash and putting them into a seed orchard. So they are creating seed, you know, additional seed. So yeah, there's some really exciting stuff going on with resistance, and it's more encouraging than I expected it to be.
Yeah, I'd just like to add to, you know, Colleen being on the call, which is so great to see you, Colleen. You know, because again, state partners, the Maine Forest Service, in the efforts that they have done in terms of monitoring for EAB, maintaining a quarantine zone in terms of trying to influence, you know, the spread of EAB, and actually kind of getting excited about the science, you know, and potential of retaining ash in our forests in the future. It's so critical. You need to have different partners. Like it's a state, private landowners. It takes multiple entities working together, and the Maine Forest Service has been a steadfast partner in our work over the years. So I think it's important to acknowledge.
And with partnerships being such a key theme in your work, there's a question in the chat about partnerships, specifically partnering with the tribal nations that you work with. Have your partners from tribal nations identified barriers to being involved in EAB management? And has there been any hesitation? I know, Tyler, you addressed data sovereignty, and also is there hesitation around disclosing locations of ash populations?
Yeah, there's definitely been concerns raised about releasing the sites if it's a project that requires publication, if it's federally funded and you have to share a report at the end. But there's ways in which tribal nations are thinking through that process to make sure basket makers that are involved in the project can feel comfortable in doing so, and they're not releasing that information to hands that should not have that information. So tribal nations are taking the most precaution because they're the community, which is really great in some of the work that I've been doing with the Passamaquoddy Forestry Department, because I can take those lessons and apply it to research related projects that we're doing. And then as far as barriers, yeah, staff capacity has always been a barrier with all projects. You know, it's hard to compete with private industry when you know, the rates that you can offer to an employee are going to be higher than that of what you can offer a tribal forester. And to keep people on staff when it's a ways away from the community and it's rural areas, same challenges that the forest industry faces as a whole in these kind of secluded areas. And then the funds that are available, there's always not enough funding, right? We want to do so much work, but it's a challenge when you can't find the funding to do it. And that's definitely the case in Emerald Ash Borer response.
I might jump in on that too. When we're thinking about collecting inventory on conserved lands, we need to think very, very carefully about how that data is being presented, if it's being presented to the public. So we're experimenting with other tools now, such as iNaturalist, where you can report a sighting without necessarily reporting to the public where that sighting is. But that needs to be run through a process of tribal consultation because there have been a lot of concerns expressed about that knowledge being publicly shared. But on the other hand, there are a lot of requests from tribal partners to obtain maps and inventory of ash on their land. So it's balancing that, like, how do you collect the information, but then make sure that it's stored appropriately with tribal communities and not necessarily with land trusts.
Thanks. And we have just a few minutes left. And I know also that this conversation will continue beyond the session, but I just wanted to put out there one last invitation for anyone who wanted to raise their hand and ask a real-time question before as the session winds down.
If there's no real-time questions, we will kind of look at the chat questions again. And I know there was actually a few questions about more potential collaboration of northern Maine up into Canada, that area, especially where Tyler has his study site. So there was some, I thought I saw something about a group call. So we're going to follow up with what you've shared in the chat and get back to some folks too, related to some of the chat communication that's been going on. And also thanks for those that added resources and other things in the chat space. That looks helpful. So we'll definitely be looking at that more closely.
Great. And I see Mark has a raised hand.
Yeah, I want to compare the biological control with an example, the successful biological control for mile-a-minute vine. It goes to a patch and stays there and gets the percentage of vines that of the invasive vine down to a small level, but doesn't entirely remove it. And does the biological for emerald ash borer kind of stay on the trees that it's protecting and stay there, or does it have to be reintroduced?
Colleen can tap
Colleen,
in on that.
Yeah, Colleen would be the perfect person. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so the hope is that this will be a classical biological control. So we will release them out there. They will develop some kind of equilibrium with emerald ash borer. EAB will never ever go away. So if we can just keep the EAB numbers low enough so that ash trees can survive and still be part of the forest, that is the hope. There is certainly some evidence to say that we know that it establishes, that it spreads, it can follow the front of emerald ash borer. It could travel a few miles a year. And so we do know that it can distribute throughout an area. In places where it has been released, there is evidence to show that it is protecting the smaller trees. We're not quite sure the bigger trees, exactly how big the trees are. Ash trees with really thick bark, will they be saved? Certainly we know that some of the pole-sized trees can potentially be saved. So it still is a lot of research is being done, but it's promising. But yeah, it's never going to make EAB go away.
Well, thank you. And so I just wanted to thank once again our presenters for sharing this wonderful information with us and this example of an engaged project, example of rich partnerships, for generating so much conversation that will continue beyond. And I want to just say a couple brief words about where we're headed with the day. Please stay with us. We have several upcoming sessions throughout the rest of the day, including a session on forest invasives and climate change coming up at 12:45, a session on managed relocation as a restoration tool, and then research lightning talks. So some researchers from the RISC team will be presenting on their research, and that is starting at 2:45. So we'll move from here into our pause for lunch, and we'll be resuming at 12:45. And thank you again to the team from University of Maine for teaching us and being in conversation with us this morning.
Welcome back, everybody. Welcome back, everyone. We're about to get started with our afternoon sessions. Our first session after our lunch break is Forest Invasives and Climate Change, and Carolyn Marshner from Cornell University is going to be our moderator. So Carrie, go ahead and take it away.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us for what a very favorite topic of mine. I hope you guys all enjoy this session. We've got some great people lined up. We are going to have Sandy Liebholt present first, and then Emma Hudgens, and then Gary Fish, and then Dustin Brunson. So everybody's going to introduce themselves. So Sandy, take it away.
Okay, can you guys hear me and see my screen okay?
Yes.
Great, okay. I'm Sandy Liebholt. I'm with the U.S. Forest Service Northern Research Station. I'm actually in the Czech Republic right now working this week, but I'm happy to join everybody here. And I'm going to be talking about a project that I've been involved with, looking at the impacts of forest invasives, forest non-native insect and disease species on biomass loss and conversion of live carbon to dead carbon. Probably as many of you know, I've been listening to some of the talks in this program, and of course many people talking about various types of non-native forest insects and diseases, and as probably you also know, that this is a problem that's really being experienced all over the world. And so what we're seeing here is being experienced with this sort of steady accumulation of new non-native forest insects and diseases that's happening all over the world. Lucky us, in the northeastern US and eastern Canada is really it's a hotspot for invasions by these organisms. And, there's a long story why that is. Part of it obviously has to do with the long history of human civilization in the eastern part of North America. But one of the key aspects of the impacts of these organisms is that many of these species, things like emerald ash borer, have tremendous impacts on killing trees and basically converting live woody biomass to dead woody biomass. And so the question really is, well, what's the impact of this on carbon resources, forest carbon? Because as you know, the sequestration of carbon is a key aspect of climate change mitigation, and the eastern forest represents one of the largest stocks of live carbon in North America. So potentially there's a big impact here. And what I'm going to be talking about is really just part of the carbon cycle, which is a lot more complex, but really what I'm going to be talking about is how insect and disease invasions, they cause this conversion of live forest carbon to dead forest carbon. There's a lot more to the stories I'll mention a little bit later, but this is really just one part of the carbon cycle, but it could be a key aspect. And let's see. Okay, and so our approach in analyzing this problem is using a vast amount of forest inventory data. In the US, there's the US Forest Service Forest Inventory Analysis Program that has about 100,000 permanent forest inventory plots located across the US. And in each of these plots, every 3 to 5 years, every plot is remeasured, and these data can be used to assess changes in growing stock, including tree growth, but also tree death. And so our approach in analyzing this problem is we have a database we call the Alien Forest Pest Explorer, which is a county level data set recording the distribution of non-native forest insects and diseases in the US. And we basically compared the tree mortality in the invaded range with tree mortality of the same host species in just outside of the invaded range. And by making those comparisons, we basically attributed those differences to the invasion itself. And so these are just some examples of the data involved, just for 4 different of these as examples of the pest species we're looking at. And in terms of the total numbers, we estimate there's somewhere a little less than 500 species of non-native forest insects and diseases established across the US. In the literature, only 90 of those, maybe around a fifth, actually are recorded as causing any damage. Most of these are innocuous, but 90 cause damage. And of those 90, 15 in the literature, there are reports of them causing widespread tree mortality. So these are the candidates that we wanted to look at. And as you'll see, we only detected regional impacts on forest biomass in 9 of these species. So these are the 15 species. You're probably familiar with most of these. Some of these have been here over 100 years. Some of these are much more recent arrivals. And again, they represent both non-native insects and tree pathogens. And so these are basically the results of the analysis, that these are ranked. So again, we compared tree mortality in the invaded range to the background levels of mortality in the uninvaded range. And in terms of which of these pest species has the greatest impact in terms of which has the biggest difference between tree mortality invaded range versus background, was actually laurel wilt disease. Laurel wilt disease itself, only has a limited number of hosts, at least so far in the southeastern North America. But in terms of having bigger, so again, you recognize these 9 species. So I'll plot them again here. This is showing the species rank now in terms of the total forest biomass that they're converting over, because again, things like laurel wilt disease, they have this huge impact, but because their hosts don't amount to a huge amount of forest biomass. In this case, Dutch elm disease and emerald ash borer come out as the 2 top ones. My guess is that if this was based on data going back to 2015, if we were to perform the analysis again using more recent data, my guess is emerald ash borer would be the number 1. And so basically, if you add these, the total, this is essentially annual loss expressed of teragrams of carbon per year. If you add all these up, it comes to 5.53 teragrams of carbon a year. And so, well, what is that amount? This is across the entire US. Well, as a percentage of total forest biomass, it's actually quite small. It's only 0.04 of total forest biomass in the US. But it's a little bit more if you look at across the US, the national background levels of tree mortality rate are around 4%. So it's a larger fraction of that. And actually, in fact, if you compare it with the total loss to wildfires every year in the US, it's ranges from between 4 and 15 teragrams. So it's kind of in that same range, maybe in the lower end of that same range. And one of the things about this that I think still needs, there's a lot of these things, a lot of questions about these impacts that remain to be resolved. One of these is when you have a pest invade, what's the aftermath? One scenario is that you get a lot of tree mortality, the trees die, and then you have other trees growing back to replace them. But another scenario is that you have a bunch of trees die and then you have recovery, but they do not recover to the same equilibrium levels of total biomass or forest carbon that existed prior to the invasion. And I think that this latter situation is probably actually might be true in a lot of situations. And I think because there are a lot of these pest species where we see them, they invade, they cause this widespread tree mortality, and then you get regeneration, trees coming back, but the trees never get to that same age. And I think that, one of the good examples is probably provided by beech bark disease, which again was one of the species that was right up there of having some of the highest impacts on total forest biomass and carbon. And one of the things that we know about beech bark disease is that it doesn't make beech go away, but what happens in the aftermath of beech bark disease is you get instead of having lots of big beeches, you get lots of little beeches. And I think that even with some of these other organisms, like even emerald ash borer, Dutch elm disease, we really see the same thing. The hosts may be persisting, but they're not going to be the same large trees as we before prior to the invasion. So again, we're really only looking at one part of the impact of the of this mortality on carbon cycles, because again, it's conversion of live carbon, large forest biomass to dead biomass. And what happens to that dead biomass, is another good question. We know in a natural settings, some dead wood biomass goes into the soil, and other parts are released into the atmosphere. So, there's a lot of open questions. One is about the recovery of forests after these invasions. The other is how much of this dead wood biomass is going to be released into the atmosphere. Another really big question is in terms of what's going to happen in the future is, this is a graph of accumulation of number of damaging forest insects and diseases over time. It doesn't really look like we're seeing in the long run any slowdown in the numbers of new species invading. So if we're just going to have more and more of these species accumulating, we're probably going to have a continual increase in the cumulative loss of forest carbon. So that's, in closing, this is one of the big questions about what's going to happen in the future is, will the tree biomass continue to increase as we get more of these pests? What proportion is going to be released into the atmosphere? What will they equilibrate? And of course, the big question is really, is what sort of the long-term impacts on climate change of pest invasions? So that's the last slide. And I think that Carrie, you suggested if there's time, we should have discussion or questions.
That was wonderful. Thank you so much. We already have some interesting questions for you. Somebody suggested that they would love to see a list of the publications you referenced, which I wholeheartedly agree with. If you'd be willing to send those to us, we'd be really grateful.
Yeah, I'll put in a chat window. We had the paper we published on this came out a couple years ago, and I'll paste a link to that in the chat. The Alien Forest Pest Explorer is a database. I can provide a link to that database, as well as the U.S. Forest Service Forest Inventory and Analysis database.
Thank you. Russ asked, he didn't think he saw Asian longhorn beetle on your list. Is it because it's no longer a problem?
Well, Asian longhorn beetle has really never gotten loose. As you know, it's still under eradication. So, its impacts to date have been minuscule because it's been successfully eradicated. 20 years from now, 20 or 30 years from now, the story may very well be different if eradication fails and it really takes off. But as you know, it's still under eradication and hasn't really caused much impacts at all.
So what you've measured is actual impact, not potential impact.
We're measuring actual impact, historical, like the impact over the last 20 years. So yeah, you could make projections about future impact, which might be quite a bit more.
That would answer another question, which was somebody asking why the chestnut blight impact was so small, and it's because you were using a modern data set, correct?
Yeah, exactly. Because chestnut blight is actually still killing chestnuts, but because chestnut now is not that common in terms of total forest biomass, it's quite small. So if we were to have done this study 80 years ago, it'd probably be number one. You're right. That's quite accurate. Yeah.
The follow-on question, this was from Bethany, was what I'm really interested in is your opinion about reintroducing blight-resistant chestnut. So do you have a few thoughts on that?
Well, I'm probably not the biggest enthusiastic person about the restoration of I mean, I think it's a nice thing to do for planting in your yard and stuff like that, but I'm actually quite skeptical that it would take, probably thousands of years before we would see chestnut really becoming a significant component of natural forests across the US. But I'm all for people planting in their garden or their backyards. It's fun, but I don't, because the way that forests regenerate in the eastern United States, we rely on natural regeneration of trees, and so you can throw out a few trees here and there, but it's only going to be a minuscule part of the total forest biomass.
Sure. Yeah, and then a couple of people asking about whether this was the continental U.S. or did you include Hawaii or the Pacific? Because
no, we didn't include Alaska and Hawaii. No, sorry, all the Hawaiians.
They were wondering because Casey said he recalled rapid Hawaii.
Yeah, no, that's actually an interesting system. So yeah, no, yeah, unfortunately, yeah, no, we didn't include Hawaii. And of course, the other thing is that most of the, and that's another thing that, as I was showing before, most of the highest concentration of the most damaging pests are in the northeastern US. But again, that's something I think over time is probably going to change. I would anticipate that more and more we're going to see more of the damaging forest pests in the West. Although it is an interesting thing. I always think it's really one of the interesting things that in the Northeast, the Eastern US, I actually think one of the reasons why we've had so many more of these damaging pests is because the forests in the East are actually more diverse. There are many more genera of trees in the Eastern US. And so that basically creates a bigger target. It's more ecological niches for insects and diseases. So we have a higher probability of those species establishing. On the flip side, I think that higher diversity, it probably makes forests in the East much more resistant or resilient to the impacts because when one tree species dies, it's like when chestnut disappeared, probably oaks are occupying a lot of the ecological niches that chestnuts did. And it would be very different, say, if we had something that wiped out all of the pines or ponderosa pine in the West, that probably nothing would take their place. Yeah.
Thank you so much. There are a few more questions in the chat if you'd be willing to take a look at them.
Sure.
But it's time for us to move on to Emma Hudgens. Thank you. Emma, are you ready?
I am.
Wonderful.
Just getting the screen sharing going. Should be good. Hey, thank you so much. And it's such a pleasure to follow Sandy because he features really heavily in my presentation. And this work kind of follows on, giving more of an urban side to some of the story that we were just discussing. So I'll be presenting a few projects today, moving from the more descriptive ecological to the more prescriptive management side of still thinking about invasive forest pests and specifically those that cause substantial damage in the contiguous US. So sorry again, Alaska and Hawaii. But this work was done in partnership with a really big network of collaborators across North America, but also in Oceania, and includes collaborators at the Canadian Forest Service and the USDA Forest Service. Turn my mic up. Okay. I'm not sure if I can do that on my end, but I will try to speak louder. Can you hear me all right now? Anybody? Put in the chat. Okay, awesome. So Sandy is one of the partners on this project as well. And as you mentioned, the number of forest pest invasions continues to rise around the world. And we know that their introduction has already fundamentally altered many of the world's ecosystems. Here I'm showing a street before and after emerald ash borer has entered. And this is really important for urban dwellers in the face of climate change because urban tree health is really fundamental to urban well-being and is going to be continuously threatened as the climate warms, because urban trees provide things like lowering cooling costs, increasing air quality, and improving our physical and mental health outcomes. And it's also really important for future urban resilience. So I'm going to be, again, moving from the ecological to the economic to the management side across these three projects, where the first project looks at describing the spread of all of this whole set of invasive species. My underlying data is actually the same as what Sandy was describing, coming from the Forest Inventory and Analysis Program and the Alien Forest Pest Explorer. And so we're looking at species across these 4 different feeding guilds. So we have wood borers, defoliators, sap feeders, and pathogens in this data set. And while we know a lot of these species exist in the United States, we didn't have historical spread trajectory information for many of these species. So this motivated my search for a general model to look at the spread of all of these species at the same time. So I fit a single model to this whole suite of 72 pest species, and this included a population growth component and also a dispersal component across sites that was a function of local tree information like host density, as well as human activity information like income and population density. And because this model only relied on the date of first detection of each of these pests and their current distribution, I was able to fit it to the whole set of invasive species without relying on temporal spread trajectories. I used simulations to determine the parameters that best allowed simulated invasion dynamics to recapture the observed invasion dynamics throughout their host range to end up at the present day distribution. And what we found was that this full model explained over 3/4 of the variation in pest ranges and had 74% locational accuracy within the contiguous US. And this really showed that the dispersal of this large suite of species was happening in a pretty consistent way across this broad set of life histories, which we took to mean that there was a consistent role of humans in spreading these species at large scales. This is an animation of those predictions over time, where you can see the large time history that the data span, with a rapid spike in the Northeast in recent decades. So later project during my PhD, still working with Sandy, worked to refine this model, where we knew that this general model wasn't perfect. So we tried to adjust it with more species-specific components while keeping some of the power from that general model, including things like climate restrictions for certain species where there was evidence in the literature that they were climatically limited, and also including expert information on where they likely entered first in the US, which was known to a different degree of certainty with each of these pest species. And what we were able to find is that there was only a handful of species that were climatically limited, including hemlock woolly adelgid, which is limited by minimum January temperatures. And so this allowed us to create a forecast considering future climate and also considering future human population growth. But across species, we found that most of the major spikes are going to be caused by growth of human population centers, for instance, around Chicago, and also the attractiveness of large swaths of hosts from large urban or large forested areas across the US. So the picture does look more than just Northeast focused moving forward, but is broadly driven by those host trees as well. So now I'll be looking at models of economic impact. I'm focusing on street trees in this study, which is only a small subset of all of the urban trees that are impacted by forest pests, but it's really the only situation where we at least have a tiny picture of what their distributions look like. So this project involved combining these previous forecasts of insect spread. Oh, I should also mention I excluded pathogens from this component just because we had a lot more uncertainty about their impacts. Street tree distributional models, which I created based on a large database of urban tree inventories collated by Mark Ambrose and Frank Koch, and some crude estimates of the likely mortality risk posed by each pest on each host. But you'll see that the only mortality risk that really dominates this is the mortality caused by EAB, because that really drives our economic impact estimates. So, like I said, I had to upscale these tree inventories from about 600 communities to closer to 30,000 to get an idea of what the urban host tree distribution looked like for the hosts of this suite of species. And in doing this, we found that 1.5 million street trees are predicted to die in the next 30 years from just the pests that are already present in the United States. And thinking about the Asian longhorn beetle question, this excludes Asian longhorn beetle because we're assuming that we were able to keep it under eradication. But just including these species that are already present, 1.5 million street trees will die, and this will cost $31 million a year just in removal and replacement costs of dead and dying street trees. And emerald ash borer was predicted to cause 90% of this damage. So keeping that in mind, I am now in my postdoc looking at figuring out how we might minimize that future impact and change those spread trajectories. So I have models of where I expect EAB to get to and where those street ash are that it will interact with. I'm trying to understand different scenarios of management interventions that I can input into my simulation framework to minimize that future ash exposure to EAB. And I was particularly interested in doing this for emerald ash borer, not only because of its major economic impacts, but also because there's been a recent shift at the federal level in the management strategy to combat this species, where the previous quarantine boundary at the federal level shown here has been replaced with a focus at the federal level on biological control release. And at this point, there's kind of a patchwork of different states taking different approaches in terms of whether they're regulating the movement of wood in response to emerald ash borer anymore. And so I'm comparing these two different strategies because they figure in really nicely into my simulation model, either impacting population growth locally, which is what we expect biological control to do, or impacting dispersal, which is what we expect import restrictions and export restrictions to do. And what we found is that across simulations, the best strategy always involves a combination of both approaches, and that implementing this combination of approaches could save up to a million additional ash street trees from being exposed by 2050 to emerald ash borer. And I should also note that the biological control sites that we are targeting in these optimizations tend to be located around major urban areas with more of a quarantine region around the outside. We're also suggesting that the West Coast really invest more in biological control and quarantines. And right now, Washington State has no regulations on the movement of wood. And there has been this recent jump of emerald ash borer over to the West Coast. So we're really suggesting that be a priority. So just to recap these projects, I found that large-scale pest dispersal is quite consistent across species, likely due to this large-scale role of humans. But to really look at how those distributions translate into impacts, we also need to overlay where those hosts are and the mortality risk. And so when we do that, we find that it's mostly emerald ash borer driving this impact signal, and that we can use these optimizations to create different scenario models of different actions that we could be taking in response to these threats and figure out the best solution moving forward, given the information we have. All right, that's it. I'd like to thank that network of collaborators, my current and past labs, and all my funding sources over the years. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That is a really interesting research. We have a question from Tom. Does street tree mortality account for poor planting or management practices like tree pits, line clearance cutting, poor irrigation mortality?
Right. So actually, this question reminds me of Sandy's metric of background mortality that he was showing. And actually, the street tree mortality caused by pests is quite minor in comparison to the background mortality of street trees, which over the same 30-year window is something like 40% or something. So the biggest thing we could be doing to save street trees is actually just doing a better job at keeping them alive, even in the absence of threats. And these metrics are over and above that background mortality.
Oh, that's really interesting. Does anybody else have questions for Emma? You can unmute or you can put something in the chat.
One thing that might be of interest that we also looked into, just because there was a question about Asian longhorn beetle with that urban impact paper, we were looking at the potential of citrus longhorn beetle entering the US and what impacts that could cause, because it's a species that's quite similar to Asian longhorn beetle that isn't necessarily, we don't know if it's going to be eradicated in the same way, and it has quite a wide host pool of some of the species that are the dominant players. Once ash kind of gets killed in most of the urban areas, there's going to be a lot of maples and oaks. So we expect that to be a potential big future threat, given that it has a potential for major impacts to the remaining host trees that make up the majority of urban areas.
Do you think that yes, somebody was thinking exactly what I was. Russ says, well, it's sad to lose so many ash trees in urban areas. Maybe the silver lining is a diversification of street trees with a wide range of species. And I was just thinking, do you have any recommendations? Like, would diversifying the street tree pool, would that help with the overall mortality, do you think, in the future?
There's kind of two sides to it. So overall, the more different types of species you have, the more potential pests, I suppose, you could host. But because these super high impact pests are so rare, even if you can host a large variety of different pests with a more diverse host community, you probably are diversifying your risks to a point where it's probably worth it, and that you don't have to lose all of your trees all at once. So I would say, yeah, planting, I always forget the numbered rule, but there's something to do with a certain number of trees in a certain amount of area. Sandy's nodding. It's like 10, 20, 30 or something is the rule. But yeah, there's a big tree planting campaign. So I'm in Canada, and there's a big tree planting campaign here, 2 Billion Trees program. And they have been putting a big emphasis on diversity and planting native trees, which I think are both good ideas.
Thank you so much for your talk. It was awesome.
Thank you.
It is time for Gary Fish to start his talk. Are you ready, Gary?
Yeah, I'm ready.
Thank you.
me. You should be seeing it all right now.
Looks great.
Okay. So I'm Gary Fish. I'm the Maine State horticulturist and the state plant regulatory official for the state of Maine. And I'm going to talk a little bit about expanding invasive forest pest ranges in Maine, and primarily in regards to hemlock woolly adelgid, as was mentioned earlier. It is basically minimized now by cold temperatures in January, or in the winter time. And classically, I think that the data shows that winter lows below 10 degrees Fahrenheit, below zero, are what causes most mortality, but also possibly some sudden cold snaps, either early fall or late spring, could also have a little bit of an effect when the insects are more susceptible to that. And basically they do have a couple of different regenerations per year, and they can rebound quickly even after that winter mortality. And unfortunately, there are some troubling trends in terms of we are having greater cold tolerance that seems to be developing in the hemlock woolly adelgid, and at the same time we're getting milder winters in Maine. This year we had really mild weather all the way deep into December, and then finally we did have a really cold snap a couple of weeks ago. And so both of these trends have already sort of shown up, changing things in Maine in terms of maybe an expanding range. This comes out of a Carey Institute paper where they're basically suggesting that there will be an expanding range for hemlock woolly adelgid over the next few years. And if you look at the progression of hemlock woolly adelgid from where it started back in 1951 in Maryland, you can see how it keeps creeping northward, and it has creeped northward in the state of Maine. In Maine specifically, we've had a number of new detections just this past year. It historically started down here in southwestern Maine, and then moved into the blue areas, and then the purple areas, and most recently into these yellow hatched areas. And it is appearing to move, further northward as we get these warming winters. And it was in 15 new towns this year through the surveillance that was done by the Maine Forest Service. The most northerly one is probably in Gardner, Maine. It is a little bit warmer. It is affected by the the Kennebec River, which makes it a little bit warmer there, but at the same time, they do appear to be moving quite a bit as opposed to where we had found them before, which was pretty much hugging our coast, which is, definitely a much warmer climate throughout the whole year, including the winter, other than the early springtime. And we've had quarantine in place, the blue areas. The quarantine has been town by town. We've tried to have a quarantine that was 2 towns in from wherever the last find was for hemlock woolly adelgid. And we're going to be meeting in a couple of days, a couple of evenings with forestry folks to ask them what they think about changing some of our quarantines, including this one, where we're probably going to propose that it actually go the whole counties of Waldo and Kennebec and Androscoggin and Cumberland, and maybe even cut across this part of Oxford County. So anticipating that as our winters warm, it's still going to continue to march its way inland, and we want to be prepared for that. If you look at some work that was done on modeling a while ago, this happened quite a few years back, but they were predicting where hemlock woolly adelgid would be going in 30-year intervals, 81 to 2010. And in here, they were looking at the cold mortality was 91% all along pretty much the coast of Maine. So this prediction certainly is not what's happening. We've headed on the coast of Maine for some time now. And then 2011 to 2040 is maybe a little bit more like what's happening now. There is a fair amount of mortality, but because the insect can reproduce fairly quickly with one individual, it can persist and repopulate. And here you see, going on to 2041, all the way up to 2100. And even in this situation, it may be that we're getting close to maybe this level already. And who knows what it will be like, into 2100. Maybe the entire population of hemlock in Maine will be infested. I just also wanted to just show the kind of the temperature trends that are out there for the state of Maine. If you look at Portland, I do see there is a bit of a trend upward in these minimal winter temperatures. So this is the lowest temperature for the reporting area from 1875 to 2023. And you can especially see from around 1960 to 2020, I think there's a fairly upward curve there. Same thing goes for Bangor, which is quite a bit further inland. It is moderated as well by a river, the Penobscot River, but this one I think even shows a little bit more of an upward curve. And then if you go to my hometown of Farmington, which is in the Western Mountains, again, you can see the same sort of upward curve. So if we continue to see these warming low temperatures in the winter, then that's going to allow the hemlock woolly adelgid to move further inland. Then just wanted to mention, and I think we heard about this yesterday as well, but there are biological controls that are being released in different parts of the country, and some of them have been released in the state of Maine. And I think that some research is being done on whether or not these biological controls will also be limited by the winter temperatures. And as hemlock woolly adelgid moves further inland, will that also allow the biological controls to stay with it, or will those fall off because they're not as winter hardy? And really only the future can tell. Here you can see the difference in size between the biocontrol and the hemlock woolly adelgid itself. So the different cold temperatures are going to have different effects on those organisms. Skipping to another forest pest that we've been looking at recently and seeing some more finds of it further inland from where it historically has been is European larch canker. You can see here, this is pretty old research that was done by the Canadian Forest Service. They were predicting that European larch canker would be sort of in this core area in 2008. And then in 2010 to 2039 to actually move quite a bit inland and actually reduce the amount that was along the coastal areas and basically just move inland and keep moving inland and go up into Newfoundland. And what we've seen recently in Maine is a number of new finds that are kind of in this yellow area. Our current area that's regulated under quarantine is the light blue. And we're looking to propose to move it inland quite a bit because we're thinking that we're starting to see with warming temperatures, this disease actually expanding and moving inland in Maine. And then the last one I wanted to talk about is spotted lanternfly. It may or may not be a forest pest. It could be a problem for sugar maples and maple syrup production. It may also be a stressor on other trees. And looking at there's a multiple different models that have been used to try to figure out the suitability of habitat for spotted lanternfly in the Northeast. And in Maine, you can see a couple of higher spots and mostly medium spots. And it'll be interesting to see what does occur. It's already established down here in Massachusetts. It did come into New Hampshire in the Durham area, but it has not established there. So we don't know if that's winter mortality or if it can't persist there. If you look at the latest data from the Forest Service researchers and frost mortality, you can see that in most of the areas in Maine and New Hampshire and Massachusetts have pretty high, overall mortality, but not high enough to, keep this insect from coming into Maine. And eventually we'll probably have it. And I'm sure that unfortunately climate change will probably have an effect, because one of the limiting factors to spotted lanternfly is that its eggs develop very late in the fall. And if you have an early frost, it kills the gravid females before their eggs are able to mature and they're able to lay those eggs. And those that do survive seem to have eggs that aren't as viable. So just some references, and this is one of my favorite hemlocks that's on Bigelow Mountain up in Western Maine. That it's pretty impressive. And with that, I would take questions.
Thank you so much, Gary. That's a very informative look at what's there and what's coming for Maine. We have a couple questions already. The first one is, what about beech leaf disease from Russ? Is it in Maine? It's a problem in Massachusetts.
So we do have beech leaf disease. It popped into Maine a couple of seasons ago, and it has moved inland from kind of our mid-coast area to a southern part of Penobscot County. I don't think we really know whether that's going to be limited by climate or not. In fact, I don't think we all even know exactly what is the cause of it. There seems to be an association with a nematode, but don't know if that nematode is carrying some other factor that is causing the disease. Unfortunately, in Maine, it's coupled with beech bark disease, and we're seeing some pretty severe impacts in areas where it first showed up in mid-coast Maine, where there's actually mortality of trees already.
I'm really sorry to hear that. Next question was from Elizabeth. You mentioned HWA moving inland. Is there concern about HWA continuing north along the coast, or concerns that there might be undetected HWA populations in Washington County?
Well, we definitely expect that it's going to reach Washington County. We know that it's already in Nova Scotia as well as New Brunswick. So it most likely will show up there. There could be that could be a factor of where hemlock actually is. There's more hemlock in other parts of the state than there are in that part of the state. There certainly is hemlock there, and eventually it'll probably show up. It may also have something to do with where the monitoring happens or where the population is that's been reporting it to us, because we do get a fair amount of reports from the public as well. And we do have a network of schools that are working together with our Marine Resources Institute at the university, where they are actually have classes going out doing monitoring and looking for the hemlock woolly adelgid and reporting that to us. So it's really a great collaboration.
Great. And Colleen also mentioned that the Forest Service does an extensive HWA survey.
Right.
Colleen, would you like to share? You're muted.
Sorry, yeah, I just wanted to mention that yes, we do an active survey both within the quarantine zone and towns that are outside that we haven't found or hemlock woolly adelgid yet, but we also do a survey in towns surrounding the quarantine zone just to be sure that adelgid has not moved beyond the quarantine. Now, there's definitely no guarantee that we find it because we're just looking at a few spots in each town, but we do survey pretty extensively for it. And maybe
Thank
I'll
you.
also mention that in addition to climate change affecting or cold wet temperatures affecting where hemlock woolly adelgid is, drought is making a big difference in tree mortality, and you know, if we with more extreme weathers and we get droughty summers, our hemlock trees just succumb to hemlock woolly adelgid so much faster than they would otherwise. Makes a huge difference.
We're seeing the same thing here in New York, fortunately. There are a couple more questions, but it's actually time to move on to the next talk. So, Carrie, if you'd be willing to drop any answers that you have into the chat and maybe any useful references from your talk.
Can do.
And so next up is Dustin Ronson. Are you ready?
I am. Let me share my screen here.
Thank you.
Carrie, can you see that yet?
Yes, they can. It looks great.
Okay, I'm gonna.
Although it's not in presenter mode yet.
I think let's see. I'll hit it again. There it goes. Hopefully it stays there. All right.
Perfect. Thank you.
Well, hi everyone. My name is Dustin Bronson, and I'm a research plant physiologist. I'm also with the Northern Research Station. I'm based in northern Wisconsin, and I'll start off the bat right now that saying a lot of the work I'm going to present here over the next few minutes is very kind of Great Lakes based, and so I've heard a lot of comments that I'm going to come back to because we're going to talk about enrichment plantings. And as Sandy's already mentioned, I know a lot of the eastern states do not do these enrichment plantings or artificial regeneration. But I'm going to share our experience, and it might lead to a bigger conversation. Actually, right now, I want to take a slide here and talk about in the Forest Service, we have these opportunities to do details. And I'm actually in a detail right now with the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science. We call it NIACS. And what NIACS does is do science translation. And there's probably people on the call here that NIACS has worked with. And so oftentimes we're working with management groups to work together to identify their objectives, to identify climate vulnerabilities, and then to come up with adaptation plans. And we do that at a variety of different levels, from one-day workshops all the way to like working one-on-one very intensely with a manager. And oftentimes when we're working with folks like this, we're working on silviculture, adaptation plans, with climate change being the major focus. And we're often thinking about resistance, resilience, and transition. What should we do with this forest? And I think it applies really well to thinking about lowland ash, or just trying to manage ash stands in general. And I've heard, from earlier this morning, John and his lab group talked about potentially using insecticides to protect ash because of their cultural importance. And so that would be one example of resistance. And so for certain landscapes and for certain number of trees and certain size areas, resistance when it comes to ash and protecting them from EAB might make sense. Resilience is a tough one, because oftentimes when we think about resilience, we think about the system being able to go through a change but come back to its initial state. And I don't think EAB, at least as far as everything I know, isn't going to go away. And so while we might have this big die-off of ash, and new ash receding, germinating, coming back, everything that I've learned so far is that we're going to lose that ash as well. And so it might be like elm, in that it gets to a certain size class and then dies off again. And so as we think about here in the Great Lakes region, where we have these large swaths of ash forest that in many cases is a monoculture, transition becomes the major kind of focus that we have. And so this is where we think about potential changes to our forest. This is a good example of the ash stands that I work in and are so common throughout Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota. You can see there in the picture in the left, just a monoculture of ash. It's very wet, a lot of sedges. You probably need rubber boots all the way almost till July, and then can get away with having leather boots. You can see the canopies and the stands we're working are already starting to die off. Ash canopies are never that significant to begin with, but we are starting to lose trees all across the state of Wisconsin, and it's working its way north. And I always try to put myself in the position of the forester, the manager, of like, what are the options I have available to me? And I always think of it as you've got three main levers: harvesting, planting, and site preparation. Harvesting can be all the way from no harvesting to clear cut or something in between. Site prep might be the use of herbicides or mowing or burning or even use of goats. But in this specific case that we're finding ourselves in, when we have a high amount of ash on the landscape and we know EAB is coming and we know it's going to kill 99.5% of the trees, planting becomes the kind of tool of choice for at least us here. There's been a lot of great work done on ash stands and management options. I'm going to highlight or just give a shout out to the Chippewa National Forest. Work that Brian Pollack and Tony D'Amato are doing is fantastic. Work that's happened in the Ottawa National Forest with Randy Kolka and Nick Bolton. It's been really good. But what we found is we start working with land managers, with management agencies, and all these really great studies that's been done, they might test 10 different species because that's what they're limited to for replication in this really complex multiple silviculture treatments. And so what we are hearing is that folks just wanted to understand a wider variety of potential species to be considered for planting in ash stands. And so I'm working with Rob Slazak, Marcelo and Mary Campione. Our student, you'll see many pictures of, is Gwen Keller. And so we said, okay, we can test a wide variety of species to plant in these lowland systems, but in order to test so many species, we have to get rid of the ecosystem complexity, multiple silviculture treatments, and we're just going to make it very simple. Effects of hydrology to begin with, and then I'm going to talk about some other effects as well. And so we've done for many years now, we've done these experiments in these stock tanks in which we can control the water. These seedlings are all from our nursery. I'm going to try to circle back to that because most nurseries are not used to planting these types or growing these types of species. These are a lot of what I'll call non-traditional species. And so the nurseries are having to learn to grow these things as well. But they're coming straight from the state nursery, the Wisconsin State Nursery, and we're testing flood duration, flood level. We're testing, I'm trying to think of the third test here. We're testing the interactive effects of flooding and light availability. So we take these outside as well, and we're testing full light, 40% shade, 70% shade, so that if you're interested in doing an underplanting or maybe a planting post-harvest, our results would be applicable to you. And then finally, one of the big things that we're doing is a number of cold hardiness tests across the state. We're actually using the state nursery. So Wisconsin has 3 state nurseries. You see the red dots there, and they're actually stratified pretty well across cold hardiness zones all the way to 3B, which is pretty cold for continental US. And so we're able to take all our species directly from the nursery and then plant them right back into the nurseries. And then take our stress species, the ones that we have undergone a number of hydrology testing that might be at different levels of stress, and plant them out into the nurseries as well. And between all these hydrology tests, cold hardiness tests, light interactive effects, we feel like we can come up with a good list for managers to start to consider. And the funny thing is that some of the best performing species under these highly flooded conditions. So for instance, our best performers here were flooded for the entire growing season. And you can see the water level all the way up to the root collar there. And our best performers, bald cypress, sycamore, and river birch. And bald cypress, I believe its most northern range, at least when you look on the Forest Service map, it might be southern Illinois. And here we are, we're planting this in nurseries over winter, all the way across northern Wisconsin. And we're seeing some really interesting results. We know that through the growing season perspective, bald cypress, as well as sycamore, as well as river birch, does incredibly well during the growing season. River birch does really well during the cold. Sycamore and bald cypress have spotty results. But the funny thing is that these 2 species do very poorly in our most northern nursery, where it's sandy soil, they're fully exposed. But when we've outplanted them into stands that are lowland riparian stands that get that never freeze, the water table never freezes. They have these large sedge grasses that fill up with snow and almost make a thermal blanket. They do incredibly well, all the way to our most northern county of Bayfield County, Wisconsin. So we have to use our results with a grain of salt from the nursery, because we actually think the lowland systems might actually protect these species when they're at their most vulnerable stage. If we take the water level and we back it off to 14 centimeters at the water table, so you've got 14 centimeters of aerated soil, you dig down, hit the water table, it takes you 14 centimeters till you hit that water table. Our list of species that are viable for planting in these systems expands incredibly. And you can see the full list here. We have a publication out. We have a second one coming out here any minute. I'm going to highlight a species on here. I thought I had a little box. Number 16 there is American elm. And American elm is doing really well in the study up in the Chippewa National Forest as well. This isn't the resistant varietal. This is just the native American elm. And it obviously grows in these lowland riparian stems before it was killed off. Excuse me. We heard Sandy's data. We saw Sandy's data about Dutch elm disease. But you can plant an American elm seedling and it'll grow to a sizable tree, maybe a 10-inch, 12-inch tree before it starts to die off. And I think that's incredibly important of how we think about these systems. If you're open to the idea of planting, we need to plant things that are incredibly fast growing to capture that water table, to start pumping water out into the atmosphere so we can allow the other slow growing species to become established, like cedar, like black spruce, to really try to develop as much diversity in these stands as possible. We've heard that in the other few talks this afternoon, and I couldn't agree more that we need to think about diversity. We planted a number of species that just did incredibly poorly. It makes sense in hindsight, but when we are populating our list, we tried it. We are outplanting these in the Chequamegon National Forest, in the Ottawa National Forest, our best winners, and we're getting good feedback from that they're continuing to do well. And we're furthering the study by looking at site prep and starting a brand new study this year to look at the use of herbicide. And I know herbicides have a bad rap, but we need all the tools we can get. And so we're asking the question of, is it worth using one application of herbicide if you can get these trees established, especially when you're dealing with all the invasives we're dealing with? And for some managers, the answer might be yes, that's a cost worth bearing. If it's a short-term cost, for other managers, it might be no. With that, I'll stop and take questions.
Thank you so much, Dustin. That was really interesting. So if you plant that elm, you expect it to go down eventually, but you think it's going to produce some early successional habitat. Is that what you were saying?
That's exactly, like I have interacted with so many foresters that say, like, why would we ever do that? It's going to die. And I'm like, well, yeah, it's going to die many years from now. And I think the question is, are we planting a tree because we want to harvest this for timber or fiber, 40 years from now? And if that's the only reason you're planting that tree, then we shouldn't. But in the cases of which we're trying to maintain ecological services, shading over rivers for trout streams, bird habitat, carbon sequestration, then it's going to be one of the winners that has grown alongside elm for a very long time, does incredibly well, and it'll serve its purpose while we get these other species established, because we really are racing the clock in these lowland systems.
That is fascinating. Gary says herbicides don't have a bad rap among the scientific community.
Okay. It's all about your audience, and I will say we're actually doing that study on Wisconsin state lands because I couldn't do the study on Chequamegon or Ottawa National Forest, and so I'm hoping at the end of the day we are up against so much. Sandy's talk highlighted a lot of that. Of the species pest curve is not slowing down at all. And as managers, we need every tool in the toolbox. And so everyone is going to have different values and different objectives, but my goal is to help say what is a worthy tool in the toolbox, and then you can decide whether to use it or not.
Heather's wondering if you could show again the slide of the species that didn't do well.
Sure. I know I saw you pop up there, so I started speeding up, and so I apologize if I.
No worries. And Russ was wondering, he said, I missed what you ID'd as the primary stress factor that you're looking at.
I did not do a good job of saying that. That is, can you see that, Carrie? Is that popped up now?
Yes.
Okay, so those are the ones that did the worst. I'm going to highlight that white pine is on that list, and some people might say, I know white pine does really well in lowland systems. And oftentimes what happens is that they just weren't doing anything. So our metrics of what's a good performer versus a bad performer is 1, survivability, 2, growth rate, So how much height did it put on? How much basal diameter did it put on? And then we did physiology. You can see Gwen here with our LICOR. And so we're looking at photosynthesis rates, transpiration rates, stomatal conductance. And so some of these things just hang out and didn't do much. Others just had poor survival altogether. And white pine, we just never could get established in these highly stressed systems. To answer the question you just asked about what is the major stressor, it's 100% hydrology. The funny thing is that in our modeling results, and I think it's in the paper we just published, if it's not, it's in the second paper coming out here, and that is in our model, light availability. So between full light, 40% shade or 70% shade rarely became a significant factor in explaining growth or survival. So most of these species, at least as seedlings, can do quite well whether they're in full light or even 70% shade. And that gives us, that's a good thing, because it means that we have more tools. We're finding it so hard to even do a timber harvest in these lowland systems because of our mild winters. So foresters, maybe 10 years ago, were thinking about doing a harvest and then planting post-harvest. Now I think most of them have given up on that and are now just trying to establish these enrichment plantings. So hiring a crew to go out there and plant trees under the existing ash to get them established before we lose those ash.
Great. Thank you so much. I have a bunch of questions, but in fact, I'm really happy to say that it's time to move on to our next session, which is going to be awesome. And with that, I'd like to hand it over to Jenica. And thank you so much to all of our presenters, especially Sandy, who came all the way from Europe to present to us.
Great. Well, thank you, Carrie, for the handoff. And yeah, thank you to our presenters in the last session as well. It's been really interesting to see everybody's diverse areas of interest, but also lots of areas of overlap too that help us understand impacts and sort of restoration post-management in the Northeast as well, which is a great segue to our next session. We're welcoming 3 panelists to this session, which is titled Manage Relocation as a Restoration Tool. We have Jacqueline Gill, Mark Schwartz, and Peter Clark here with us. The format for this session will include some short introductory talks from each of our panelists. And then we are reserving the last segment of the session for question and answer and discussion with all of you. So if you have questions that come up during a particular talk, please either add those to the chat like you have been, or hold those questions and use the raise hand function like some of you have also done in previous sessions to unmute yourself and ask your questions live. And we also really want to encourage everybody, if you have responses to our presenters, please join that conversation at the end of this session. So with that, I'm going to first welcome Jacqueline Gill. She's coming from the University of Maine. And Jacqueline, you should have share screen capabilities. And so I will let you take it from here.
Great. Well, thank you so much for this invitation and also for creating some space for the fossil record to join this conversation. We have 20,000 years to get through in the next 8 to 10 minutes, so I'm going to go really quickly. But I'm Jacqueline from UMaine, and I'm here to zoom out a little bit in terms of our temporal perspective. And that is because, like many of you, I'm strongly motivated by graphs like this one, which is already a little bit out of date. We know that some of the more extreme projections are likely outside the scope of what's going to happen, but so are the best projections. But one way or another, we are projected to warm the planet by somewhere between 2 and 4 degrees Celsius by the end of the century. But the way I think about that is similar to this XKCD cartoon, which is 1 ice age unit, right? So this is the difference climatically between where we are now and me, at least in Maine, being under about 1 kilometer of ice some 21,000 years ago. So this is a noticeable change in terms of the planetary system. Which means that the last deglaciation, the last 21,000 years since we reached the peak extent of our ice sheets, I think is a really good model system for understanding species responses to climate change. You can see this little animation here showing the retreat of the glaciers And one thing that means is not only was there a tremendous amount of climate change during this interval, but every species has had to, that is currently found in places that were glaciated, has had to get there, right? They've had a certain amount of time to be able to shift their ranges. So we see a lot of different responses in biodiversity to these pretty high amplitude and often very rapid climate swings. So even though we're talking about geologic timescales, many of the climate shifts that we see are very relevant to what we see today in terms of the rate and magnitude. And the fossil record shows us several syndromes in terms of how plants are responding. This is a nice little framework by Dawson et al. In Science. We often hear about move, adapt, or die. But the paleo record also shows us that many species, including plants, can persist in place while the climate changes around them. And whether that's because they have broader environmental tolerances than we expect, or than we can capture with our kind of modern snapshot, or for other kinds of reasons that we may not fully understand. But that move, adapt, or die model needs a little extra complexity because persistence is part of that story. And when it comes to plants, dying is very rare. We have only one documented plant extinction in North America that we think resulted from these climate changes. So extinction tends to be pretty rare in plants in general. Even when you zoom out to the scale of the Cenozoic and beyond, plants do really well in mass extinctions compared to other taxa. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't have cause for concern. So one thing that we know is that following deglaciation, these plants experienced range shifts on the order of hundreds to thousands of kilometers, in some cases quite rapidly. And the way in which they underwent those range shifts was highly individualistic. So plants are radical Gleasonian ecologists, right? They don't hold the Clementsian models. And so if you look at maps like this, we go from 21,000 years ago to the present. You can see this is spruce pollen and oak pollen. And if you just kind of glance between them, you can see that both of these tree taxa had restricted ranges in refugia south of the ice sheets, and also that they had their own individualistic pathways in terms of how they migrated out of those refugia. So we can use the fossil record to inform both how and the role that refugia play in allowing plants to persist, but also the rates at which plants are able to track their climates as the climates become ameliorated as we come out of the last deglaciation. So if we were to follow a couple of iconic taxa from the Acadian forest, which is where I live here in Maine, one thing that's really interesting here is that these ranges are much more dynamic than we might expect. And each one of these maps is a 1,000-year time step. So we're restarting at 21,000 years. And so if you look here, this is the abundance of spruce pollen. Here I am in Maine, right here. And one thing that's really interesting is that by about 3,000 years ago, spruce had migrated out of the state completely and actually only comes back down in the last few thousand years after the climates cooled and got a little bit wetter, with the exception of a couple of coastal refuges, very small populations. But just this is a friendly reminder that what we often think of as plants that really belong to or define a place, that's actually pretty dynamic over time, even on just this sort of short order time scale. And a corollary of this is that all of the plants of the Northeast or New England, they all had to shift their ranges southwards. And that meant that the southern communities had to accommodate those migrants, right? And so these southern refugia, we think most of these plants were persisting around the range of this American bellflower example, which is a really fun paper that shows some of the genetic fingerprints of these glacial refugia from sort of multiple restricted populations. But these plants that were already hanging out in the Southeast had nowhere to go. They ran up against the Caribbean and the Atlantic, which means that they had to accommodate all of the northern migrants, which then separated back out into the Northeast as the glaciates retreated. And now we're going to see the reverse, right? Now it's our turn to accommodate all of those southern migrants as they start to move and track their climates northwards. And we can see the fingerprints of these glacial climate changes on biodiversity today. So we have very high levels of tree diversity. in the eastern US, which is where I do a lot of my work. And it's not an accident that that high diversity is concentrated in these areas of glacial refugia where there were more stable climates. So these were not just refugia for northern taxa. These are places where the rates and magnitudes of climate change coming out of the last glaciation, and for many cycles in the last couple million years, these have been milder places to live relatively from a climatic standpoint. And so, we still see the fingerprints of these glacial cycles on tree diversity and also on tree endemism, right? These kinds of heat maps all show similar patterns, right? And so again, just as these southern ecosystems accommodated northern migrants, now as we warm the world, these species are going to be tracking northwards. And I see a lot of moral panic about invasive species caused by climate change. When we're talking about species that, maybe originated in the middle Appalachians and are now starting to track into the Northeast, but these are species that have a long, deep evolutionary and ecological history of coexistence, right? And that I think should really inform our understanding. So this concept of refugia comes up over and over again. It's really critical. And these are just locations where species can hang out during periods of regionally adverse climate. And the whole framework of a refugium is really centered around this idea is that the species will then expand when the conditions become more suitable in the rest of the region, right? It's not meant to be a forever home for these species. And so we've identified in some of our work, the Scudic Peninsula is one of those places where some of these coastal refugia have been really important for cool conifers during periods of time during the last sort of 5,000 to 8,000 years when the region became really hot and dry. So conditions similar to what we are expecting in the future in parts of New England. Also, the White Mountains and parts of the Adirondacks, the Greens, Katahdin, they're all current refugia for tundra species that are isolated from their populations on the Arctic mainland, many, many thousands of kilometers north. So identifying these refugial locations is going to be really critical. And so often when we look at the fossil record, this is just a pollen diagram, and you can see it goes back 15,000 years. Here's total pine pollen. This is a cute little pine grain. We see records like this and we often become bored by them. They don't show the dramatic changes that we would expect, despite the fact that this alpine location in Utah that this paper is from experienced a tremendous amount, several degrees Celsius of climate change and big hydroclimatic changes during this period. And yet we don't see a lot of change in the vegetation. And so I would urge people to, when we expect dramatic shifts in or dramatic responses in our study systems, and we don't see that, we often have this tendency to frame this as a negative, right? Like maybe this is an extinction debt or just some lagged response, but it could also be resilience, right? We may be looking at a refugium that we don't understand or some resilience that's built into a system. So stasis is not always, I don't think, always a negative. I think we should be looking for ways to better understand and disentangle when a lack of change is actually a warning sign versus a signal that, maybe there's something that these plants have figured out here or something about this system that allows persistence in the face of change. So stasis is not necessarily inherently a bad thing. We know that the ability of plants to make small elevational changes have been really critical for local persistence. This is some fossil work that was done across the White Mountains, and we're looking at plant macrofossils now, so big fragments. We're going from 14,000 years to the present. And the big take home here is that basically, even when some of these plants are dropping out from lower elevation sites, they're able to persist at higher elevations. This is something that we know is really important. So even these small scale geographic shifts of just a few hundred meters can make a really big difference for plants in terms of their ability to persist.
We're close to the end of time, Jacqueline.
You got it. All right. So one of the other things that we really see emerging in the fossil record is that because species are shifting their ranges individualistically, what we think of as communities are really just they're temporary assortments. So, for example, the spruce, ash here have non-overlapping ranges. They're highly segregated. If you look at the modern perspective, But if we were having this talk 13,000 years ago, we would be talking about them as co-dominants. And we would also be talking about ash abundances that are unlike nothing we see on the landscape today, right? So this idea of community turnover or novel ecosystems as these species are individualistically following their climatic niches around, these are emergent properties of that Gleasonian framework, right? So I'll just move forward. Oh geez, I'm totally out of time. The big take-home messages here are that when we looked at modern trees, they are only filling about 48% of their contemporary climatic ranges for reasons that we're still trying to disentangle. If you want to chase down the Seliger et al. Reference, this is one of my former PhD students. And that if we zoom out and do the same analysis in the fossil record, that lack of range filling is really something that's only accumulated in the last few thousand years. So trees are already not keeping pace with climate, but it does not appear to be a dispersal lag following deglaciation. So we don't know if this is due to some human impact or the increased strength of competitive interactions or what. So just a couple of really quick take-home messages here, and then I'll move on. We have really high rates and magnitudes of climate change that are predicted, and some of those climate velocities will be the highest in temperate and boreal forests. So those are some of the ecosystems that we're concerned about. We expect to see the emergence of novel ecosystems, which means as plants are trying to track their temperatures or precipitation, those variables may start to become decoupled. We're already starting to see that. And so where do we go from here? The fossil record can inform these discussions, but it's really rare in practice. So we should have these conversations more often. And we know that these creative conservation solutions are going to be really important because these risks, but the risks of things like managed relocation may not be as great as we fear. And we can use the fossil record to inform those kinds of decisions. And understanding vulnerability is very important, but we also don't spend enough time talking about resilience. And so identifying the locations of climate refugia should be a really top research priority. And with that, I just want to remind you that all these species are Ice Age survivors. We can learn a lot from them as we move into the future. So thanks for your time.
Thank you, Jacqueline. And there's been a very active chat, which we'll circle back to after we hear from Mark and from Pete.
Great.
So we next have Mark Schwartz joining us from UC Davis. So Mark, if there you are, wonderful. You are keyed up and ready to go. Well done. So Mark is here to provide a bit of the social perspective on managed relocation following Jacqueline's paleo perspective. Thanks, Mark.
Yeah, great. Thanks. Thanks for inviting me. It's nice to loop back. I met Jacqueline first about a little over a decade ago, and she was participating in a managed relocation working group that I was on with Jason McLaughlin and Dove Sachs and Jessica Hellman. And one of the things that working group got me interested in is thinking about the pace and scale of managed relocation and what might be barriers to adaptation. And so this is really going to, I'm a plant ecologist, but this is social science here that I'm going to be talking about. And there's lots of reasons why we might engage in managed relocation to increase ecosystem resilience, reduce species extinction risk, increase ecosystem productivity, enhance wildlife value. We know that, as Jacqueline mentioned, that we're expecting forests to fall out of alignment with climate, and the consequence is that there may be disequilibrium with distributions, and that tree migration may not keep pace with rates of change. We may want to do something about that. We might want to plant trees northward from existing ranges to help them out or help the ecosystems in which we're managing out. But here is the problem as I see it. I'm going to go through these quickly, the next 5 slides, just as I see the Northeast problem. And thinking about bringing forest adaptation to match the scale of the challenge. And this is really very general. You'd be thinking about this with managed relocation or any other problem. And that is that the Northeast is a forested landscape, that most of the landscape is forested, as you can see by the blues and the purples up in the upper right-hand corner in the Northeast there. And that forested landscape is mostly privately owned. The orange and yellow here are corporate or investment forest ownerships, but the bright green, that's really the matrix, is private family forest ownership. Blue and dark green are public ownerships. And that most of those tracts are small tracts. So most forest owners own less than 50 acres. This doesn't even include those owners that own less than 10 acres, and that most tracts are owned in less than 100-acre sizes. And so this is from Forest Service data from New Hampshire, but it's like the rest of, well, the US, in fact, but the Northeast in particular. And that when you ask those forest owners why they own forests, beauty, privacy, wildlife habitat, biological diversity, firewood, timber products, way down at the bottom there, that they own forests for a variety of reasons, but it's mostly not economic reasons for these small family ownerships. Again, this is very similar one region to the next, and you can get these out of Forest Service data. Brett Butler has been pulling together a lot of this through survey data of forest owners over the last several years. And this one is from New Hampshire, but again, is like other states, is that most of these forest owners don't have management plans, and most of the acreage under this private ownership doesn't have a management plan. And so what does this mean? It means that most forests in the Northeast are small tracts owned by private individuals for the purpose of enjoying the forest. They don't manage their forests, and they don't have a management plan for their forests. So even if they do occasionally cut some wood. And in my mind, that makes these people the ones that are least likely to instigate managed relocation. And they may also be the least accepting of managed relocation on public lands. And the reason for this is that they own these lands for a particular purpose. They like the forests they have. And my experience with managed relocation and thinking about social values is that people are uncomfortable with change, and the idea that you as a neighbor to this their forest are now planting things that don't belong there in their minds is a challenge, and it's a problem, and it's a problem that we have to manage if we're going to engage in adaptation management for forests. So we should anticipate inadequate adaptation management on private forests and resistance to that to management on public lands. And one of the things that we have to think about is managed relocation carries inherent risks. There's risks to the recipient ecosystems, there's risks to the species. And we have to manage that risk in terms of the social environment and thinking about and being very careful about assessing that risk and being public about how we inform people about that risk. So this is a work that I did with the National Park Service. They were looking for ecological risk assessment tools for their resource managers. We created a risk model that uses 17 criteria, including criteria to target species, species in recipient ecosystems, ecosystem functions of recipient ecosystems, and scores those risks in order to help inform the managers and their stakeholders of what might be risks associated with managed relocation in those locations. As I mentioned, private owners may be unlikely to engage in thorough risk assessment. They often don't have the resources to do that. And so that public agencies may need to help them out, basically to broadly assess risk and provide risk information. So should someone be planting this particular species in a new location or not? And how should they get source material for that species if they want to plant it? These may be things that public agencies and conservation organizations need to be providing to the public. And to some extent, we're doing that already. The Forest Service has adaptation guidebooks for adaptation planning, but that we really have to be proactive about getting best management practices delivered into the hands of private landowners. As we see in California, where we've had lots of recent wildfires and people are restocking lands, they're often making terrible choices with respect to where they're finding seed stock for replanting, that they're going to commercial sources that aren't particularly good at finding the genetic material that's appropriate for their location. So we have to be mindful of helping private landowners who own small tracts that are under-resourced to do good forest management. And then the public holds, we have to be mindful of the fact that the public holds rights to decision-making on public lands, and we have to think about how agencies engage the public in those decision-making actions. And so the picture over here, this is Connie Barlow. I got into this whole thing because I was working on Treya taxifolia, whose native distribution is down in Florida, that red square in the bottom, but this organization has moved this tree to lots and lots of different locations using private seed source on private lands, and mostly not engaging the public in a discourse about whether this is or is not an appropriate or a good thing for the ecology of the systems in which they're being planted. And I think that that's been a challenge for the Terrea Guardians in doing this. So I see 4 big challenges in managed relocation decision-making. Who makes decisions on public lands and how do they do this? Will they engage in careful risk assessment and a public process in helping encourage private forest owners to participate in decisions that actually impact their forests? How do states encourage adaptation management among private landowners? Can private landowners be incentivized to adapt in any way, manner, or form? How do states regulate or assist the few large corporation investment forest ownerships that actively manage for timber production? And we expect that they will be shifting their production operations to their benefit, but these may not necessarily be in the broader social good for ecological change. And then how do conservation or restoration organizations work to embed adaptation management in their planning? And here I'm thinking about things like the Conservation Fund that help devise conservation easements on private lands to create sustainable forestry. And that's great, but it hasn't historically been the case that adaptation management is part of their regular mode of operation. And we need to be thinking about how that happens. And so I want to end just with some take-home messages, and that I think we have to view public comment on public lands management as an opportunity. We often think about it as a burden, and it is a burden. It slows things down. But it's also an opportunity to help engage those private landowners in adaptation decisions that may be really critical for good social outcomes, for the pace and scale of making our entire ecosystems adapt to future climates. How do we incentivize adaptation on private lands? This is a big challenge that private landowners are likely to be reticent adaptation managers, that they may lack expertise and access. Those wanting to adapt may not have access to plant source material or have the resources to do the adaptation or the expertise, and that the costs may be very difficult. And so incentivizing this adaptation is going to be critical. This is something that we're challenged within California, and thinking about increasing fire resilience in privately owned land on the urban wildland interface. So positive leadership is crucial, that private timberlands will adapt, but not necessarily to optimize biodiversity. So public lands become a beacon for positive change. They can be a beacon for positive change. And we have to make sure that they're viewed as that, as opposed to drivers of degradation, of ruining my forest if you've purchased or own a forest for a particular set of ecological benefits that may be changing. And that protected areas like public lands are also beacons for positive change, and that we need to be leading by example, and that consulting foresters as a community are really critical to this success, because where that nexus is with the private landowners is through consulting foresters and how they help forest managers who have management plans adapt. And with that, I will let it go and move on to Peter, and then we'll look forward to questions at the end. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Mark. I feel like we've had a really interesting flow from paleo perspective to social considerations and land ownership. How do we as natural resource professionals and researchers sort of factor into this question of managed relocation? Our last panelist today is Peter Clark, coming from the University of Vermont, who's going to talk a little bit about operationalizing assisted migration in northeastern forests. So thanks, Pete.
Thanks, folks. Just had to unmute myself. Thank you all for having me. Today, I'll be largely wearing the hat from a silvicultural and forestry perspective, as much of my work takes place here in the northeastern forest, and really thinking about what it means to operationalize assisted migration and other adaptation style plantings, and bring this into potential routine use into forest operations. And so just to set the stage, as the previous speaker mentioned, for folks that aren't in forestry, particularly in this region, tree planting really isn't a tremendous part of the northeastern forestry culture relative to our neighbors in the lake states, or even in western states, or even plantation forestry down in the south. And so we oftentimes rely on the naturally abundant regeneration in our forest to be able to reoccupy space after disturbance. But there's really increasing attention on the role of adaptation style plantings in response to global change, whether that's the carbon mitigation potential or reforestation with many millions of acres and potentially billions of seedlings needed. Relative to that, there's also quite a bit of attention on the restoration of species that are culturally and ecologically important. Red spruce, American chestnut come to mind. And as many in the audience are well aware, that Northeast is really the heavyweight champions of invasive pests and pathogens. And so can tree planting for adaptation be used as a means of functionally replacing some species such as black ash, eastern hemlock that have been degraded? And so then layering within that, how can climate suitable plantings and whether they're species or genotypes be incorporated into some of these adaptation strategies? And one of the things that we see from many of the model simulations is that the Northeast is projected to be a potential hotbed for assisted migration. So this figure is change in suitable habitat, the number of species that may have increases in habitat that are not currently present in the Northeast, with corresponding declines in those native species. So maybe 10 to 20 species that may move here over long time periods that Jacqueline would be appreciative of, but may require the assisted movement to be able to move here in the time periods where climate will be suitable. And so while assisted migration is certainly has its own controversies and has been well debated, really the concern that many folks share is that many of our forests may be nearing a tipping point and potentially crossing into what we have in this figure that's in terms of a novelty domain. And so we see evidence from forests that are directly affected from global change that are already apparent, such as our western wildfire states or even black ash lowlands ravaged by emerald ash borer, where a previously forested system may be transitioning and sometimes transitioning into a non-forested system. And so given the long lifespans of forests, there's potentially a growing need to incorporate adaptation strategies that incorporate climate suitable plantings as a tool for promoting resilience and promoting the ecosystem functioning into our future forests. And so this is really the focus of assisted migration, adaptation style plantings in a forestry context, is really focusing on maintaining ecosystem function and integrity and long-term stability, rather than focusing on singular objectives, say maximizing productivity for carbon or timber, or even rescuing isolated species at risk. And so we've got quite a bit of evidence from our long-term historical provenance trials. Foresters have long been moving trees around and examining the effect of climate, transfer distance. And we generally understand that around 1 to 2 degrees of latitudinal shift can result in no depreciable changes in overall fitness, growth, survival. But many of these lessons, despite the utility of these, are largely focused on species for timber production as commercial species, and generally don't focus on non-timber species and the suite of species that exist throughout the northeastern US. Oftentimes, these are common garden experiments, so they omit some of those ecosystem dynamics, and they're also largely representative of historical conditions, and we're really not capturing, of course, what we're seeing in terms of the complexities of global change. So in the context of assisted migration in a forestry context, the devil is really in the details. So the different types of assisted migration that folks have broadly proposed are assisted population enrichment. So these are species that are within range, but maybe make up a lesser proportion of that forest. And so we're augmenting and reinforcing those numbers. There's assisted range expansion. So that's modest movements outside of that range, but where we might expect these species to move over exceedingly long time periods. And then I won't be diving into this too much, but assisted species migration, which is an example that maybe Mark gave of long distance transfers of isolated species, or even the translocation of species across continents. Now, there's really a need to localize this evidence for decision makers, and this really serves as one of the major barriers for operationalizing this. So many of our species distribution models are exceedingly coarse, especially as we think about foresters and decision makers that are localizing these decisions on the stand by stand, acre by acre level. And then additionally, what time periods are we aiming for under different emission scenarios? So these are different seed zones for planting in the Green Mountains near me, under different emission scenarios, and so what time periods are we targeted, and how do we translate these lessons to different systems, whether there are lowland systems or upland systems. And then lastly, thinking about the barriers and the logistics in terms of operationalizing this, in terms of increasing our nursery capacity to be able to support some of these and the best management practices. And so some of the lessons that we've generated from this have largely come from our work with the Adaptive Silviculture for Climate Change experiment, which is an international experiment of managers and scientists co-developing and replicated trials based on an adaptation framework. Folks are may be familiar with, but largely thinking about this at the end here of transitioning ecosystems in terms of composition. And so just looking at some of the evidence that we have from a few of these, and this is a lesson from an experiment we have in our northern hardwood systems. We've tested a suite of species across various functional traits and functional attributes. And one of the main takeaways that I want you to take here, and this is just survival data around 5 or 6 years, that those species that are coded here as PE, or the population enrichment species, they tend to be surviving at significantly higher rates relative to those assisted range expansion species, those species that would require much more movement outside of their range. And so despite many of the model projections of species moving into these regions, there's still a lagged effect in terms of moving these species into these sites. Now, this still doesn't necessarily take away from the long-term viability of these individuals being maintained on site and being relied upon as a potential future seed source. One of the main challenges that we can see, we've learned from lessons in the long-term from the past. So this is an image of R.T. Fisher from the Harvard Forest Archives doing a release cut favoring red oak post-harvest. And I know that Audrey Plotkin-Barker has evidence from this from the hurricane pull-down experiment. We really have quite a bit of resilience mechanisms in our forests in the Northeast in the form of what we call ecological memory, or the natural recruitment that exists in our forests that can ultimately resist our efforts if our goal is to transition our ecosystem from one forested state to a different type of maybe future adapted forested state. So again, despite our models suggesting that future forests are coming, there's still a lagged effect in terms of that local site being able to withstand our efforts to transition them. Shifting gears a little bit, and this is a little bit of a complicated figure to be able to go through in short order, but really highlighting some of the lacking ecological diversity in many of our forest nurseries, which really serve as the bottleneck where many of our reforestation activities come from. Essentially, what we're looking at here is red oak seedling inventory, and these are seed sources of where these seeds were obtained and grown into 3-year-old seedlings, 5-year-old seedlings for our 2022 inventories, and where a forester may be able to buy a seed source from. And really, the takeaway that I'm trying to share with you is that relative to the variable seed zones that are each coded in green or gray, really only 10 to 20% of the seed collection zones are where we could be collecting variable seedlots and genotypes and climate suitable genotypes, really underrepresenting the potential seedlot diversity in which we could be collecting. And as we cascade this down, the variable species that we might want to identify into the future, red oak is the most propagated seedling in many of our eastern forest nurseries. And so getting variable climate suitable seedlots for spruce or elm or other more niche species can be increasingly difficult here. And drawing comparisons across taxa, there's folks that are working on this, and we're really seeing this lacking ecological diversity in propagules across taxa, from brook trout to mollusks to wildflowers. We're really trying to draw attention to this, but not just within the forestry realm. So tools and ways in which we can advance this practice, we can again learn from the lessons of the past. Is red pine plantations here in the Northeast from the CCC area. Really, if our goal is to advance and incorporate adaptation plantings into the future, really emphasizing ecologically, compositionally, and structurally diverse plantings, moving away from maybe a singular objective or a monocultural approach. Again, scaling out and thinking at the landscape context, what are other landowners doing? Thinking about promoting that functional connectivity. As Jacqueline mentioned earlier, there are potential climate refuges that operate as potential source nodes into the future. So taking potential lessons from Messier's network theory approach here in terms of how those plantations can serve as future source nodes. There's also a need to really clarify policies and generate funding if this is going to be something that we want to incorporate into the future. So the federal government in many states really lack clear policies on the movement of species and the role of adaptation plantings into the future. And so if we are going to include this in our adaptive forest management, to supply funding as well as clear policies that can provide guidance to both foresters as well as nurseries who are trying to grow speculative stock in terms of species and climate suitable genotypes. And then lastly, given the novelty of some of these approaches, we're really in need of rapidly developing evidence through monitoring and data sharing. And so incorporating the lessons that we learn through various online decision support tools will be something that folks will need into the future. And so with that, I will end there, and I've included a couple of resources for folks who are interested in.
Thanks so much for that. Yeah, there's a lot of axes to consider when we're thinking about how to actually put this into practice. So thanks for organizing some of those different considerations, Pete. We've had an active chat over the course of the 3 talks. And so one of the themes that has come up is this sort of idea of lack of equilibrium. I think, Jacqueline, that you sort of originally introduced to us that, ranges are dynamic. And so then, Mark, you talked about, what is our role in that whole process, who decides and how do they decide? And Pete, then you said, well, we also have these species that, maybe we consider, or maybe we don't, because of even very practical considerations of how do we actually source them. And so I was hoping that each of you could just sort of speak to this idea of how do we identify what the reasonable restoration targets are for our project. And I realize that is a difficult question.
Why don't we go in order? Jacqueline, you go first.
I have like an evil grin because it's a great question, but I feel like my answer is going to be really provocative. So I feel like what the fossil record shows us is that you can just pick whatever baseline you want. I mean, as long maybe you have there's a species of cultural importance. You could look for a target climate that we've had in the past that we're moving towards. Oftentimes we're managing forests that were really regenerating during the Little Ice Age. And we've, even without anthropogenic warming, we would have moved out of that climate just naturally, because that was a small blip due to natural factors. Maybe we need, these forests have been managed for millennia by indigenous burning and other kinds of influences that we are still understanding using the tools at our disposal. So I think a lot of it kind of comes down to what your goals are, and just being really upfront with the goals and the values that you're bringing to the table, and making space for these to be value-laden decisions. Often we try to sort of hide behind science as though it's some sort of objective truth, even though it's done by people, not by science generating robots. And so, I think one of the things that the paleo record has really done is challenge the concept of a baseline. Is your baseline pre-industrial warming? Is it pre-European contact? Is it the KPG asteroid 65 million years ago? I'm not trying to be too flippant there, but I think we should really be interrogating this idea of baselines in general. And I would love to see us move away from managing a system as a static snapshot and trying to hold on to that, and instead shifting towards encouraging these dynamic processes that we know promote diversity and resilience. And that may not always align with our goals of, I want the forest to look the way it did when I grew up, because that's deeply important to me as a person. And both of those things, I think, are valid approaches to these questions.
Yeah, great answer. And so I think, it's very difficult in that there is no right answer in thinking about, should we be targeting 50 years out or 200 years out? When exactly is climate going to stop changing? So I think there's a big role for ecologists to inform public decision-making on this, but we can't be in a position of either thinking or pretending to think that we have the answers to these questions. They're going to be answers with inherent uncertainty. And as a consequence, we have to be very clear about stating objectives and working with the public to understand their objectives and thinking about objectives everywhere from extinction prevention for individual species to maintaining ecosystem functions and keeping forests resilient. And it's not going to be an easy task. And I think one of the things that my National Park Service friends say is that in public lands, we're often very reticent to be very manipulative managers, that they want to let nature take care of itself, and we're moving into an era where that's a less acceptable outcome. And so I think we're also grappling with this idea that for resource managers, being proactive and advocating for change is an uncomfortable position to put us in as managers, and that we're going to be grappling with that too. So I will let Peter finish that one off.
Thanks, Mark. Yeah, I think I would echo what Jacqueline and Mark have said. I'd also emphasize that I think we need to approach many of these efforts with humility. It's really difficult to accept this, but sometimes it'll be challenging to change many of our systems into the future. And so identifying those baselines has to come with some recognition that those baselines are going to be really difficult to target. Of course, from a silvicultural perspective, there are actions that we could take in the forest to be able to edge things one way or another. We're really taking a site-by-site perspective on how we maybe incorporate new species into these systems. Ultimately, I think that if you are to take a baseline and try to identify a goal, I would reiterate what I tried to emphasize in one of my slides is to try to maintain ecological function in these systems to promote that ecological resilience and from the forest perspective, keeping forests as forests. That may change in terms of the species composition structure that we see into the future. But if we can keep an eye on that rather than focusing on a singular target in terms of a objective, that might be one management tool or perspective.
Fantastic. So if I'm hearing a theme emerge from all of your responses, it's that goals of the project really dictate everything that comes after. If I had to summarize what the three of you are sort of have in common in what you're saying, and that those goals, are likely to vary from project to project. So Audrey, I don't know if you want to pose the next question. So I have a co-moderator here, Audrey Barker-Plotkin, that Peter actually mentioned in his talk. You had pulled together another emerging theme from our chat.
Yeah, I'm trying to keep track of all of the really interesting themes that are emerging, but I do think one theme that I'm seeing that was discussed around many people was, what's the difference between intracontinental, within continent, and cross-continental range shifts? Should we stop worrying about within continent range shifts? And I'll add a little addendum to that, and that, thinking about Cascade's talk yesterday, where she's talking about marine taxa, where that does seem to be a problem in some cases. Here, I think we've all been solidly thinking about plants. So, is that worry also taxa specific? So should we stop worrying about within continent range shifts? Does it matter what taxa we're talking about? Maybe just go in speaker order again, unless someone else. Looks like Jacqueline's ready to go.
Yeah, I would say that that's a pretty good framework. I would even go a little further, and there was that, I think it was a Nature letter that came out around 2011 titled "Don't Judge Species by Their Origins." I think we should focus a little bit more on impacts than on origination. Islands, or someone mentions islands are really weird anyway. I think within taxon relationships, from an invasive perspective, tend not to be as we don't see as much competition-driven extinction, for example, among plants. We see population changes, but most of the extinction is really being driven by sort of cross-trophic interactions. So, you know, coming up with some better or more nuanced categories for these kinds of relationships that have to do with impact, origin, and, you know, just traits maybe would give us a little bit more nuance, a little more wiggle room, more breathing room, I guess, when we're doing our triage, because functionally that's what we're doing, right? We can't save every single species. We can't have a recovery plan for every single species on Earth. We really have to make decisions. And so I'm in favor of using the tools that we have, including paleoecology, biogeography, and all these social sciences that we've been drawing on in these discussions to come up with more informed triage efforts, which doesn't mean figuring out which species we have to save and which we have to let go of. I think that in some cases we'll find that some species and systems are more resilient than we give them credit for. And then we can focus our narrow bandwidth, money, time, and energy on the really high risk species.
Yeah, I'd like to take the answer to this a little bit different direction. And I think that, yes, major biogeographical barriers like continental barriers and islands and even mountain ranges like the Rockies are important distinctions, and that when we're moving things within, not crossing those major biogeographic bounds, we're a lot less likely to be making mistakes that have negative adverse consequences to our recipient ecosystems. But I think that more important than the species that we're moving, we ought to be concerned about the species that we aren't moving intentionally. And that is every species we move has a microbiome, and carrying pests and pathogens, particularly in plants, has been devastating to ecosystems in the past. And we have to be very, very careful about those activities and how we plant things as we move them.
Yeah, to echo that, just to continue to ensure that we're maintaining high levels of nursery propagation protocols and monitoring the outcomes of these restoration planting efforts. In a recent review of reforestation and planting efforts, only 5% of agencies are actually monitoring the outcomes of seedlings that are being deployed. This is a global review, largely based on the tropics, but also temperate regions. And so really emphasizing this, we start to push the envelope a little bit, particularly in the context of, as we're talking about transcontinental transfers of species, really putting into place mandates like they have in Oregon and elsewhere, where reforestation activities have annual regular monitoring efforts up to 5, 10, 15 years, especially as seedlings mature into a place where there will even be sending out pollen to be able to mate with other species in the region. But there are examples of transcontinental adaptation plantings that we're familiar with, and these are largely based on Jacqueline's perspective of essentially functionally replacing species that provide core ecosystem attributes. In Minnesota, folks have used Manchurian ash, which is a common ornamental plant, but as a means of functionally replacing black ash, largely used for basket making from a tribal perspective. I'm sure folks may have heard about that. In Massachusetts, recent evaluations of the role of Norway spruce, which were planted decades ago, as conferring similar functional attributes as hemlock, which is eastern hemlock, which have been on the decline. So there certainly are examples out there, but in the context of assisted migration in a forestry context, it's generally should be generally considered to be pursued with caution, and really to emphasize my initial point, we need to be monitoring and adapting and iterating through if this is something that we are to pursue.
We want to be respectful of all of our panelists' time. So first I'll say thank you to all three of you for joining us. We are into our break period. So what I would say is if you're able to stick around for a few minutes and interact in the chat, that would be wonderful. If you have another obligation where you need to move on, We certainly understand that too, but thank you for your contributions here. And I suspect this session is going to generate lots more questions, and perhaps we can have a round 2 of this at some point. So thank you to all of our panelists here and to all of our attendees. I put in the chat that we were going to push the break a little bit so that we would have more time with our panelists. Let's plan to resume at 2:50 with the RISC lightning talks. So we will see you back in about 10 minutes.
Of the day. Thanks for restarting the recording. So we're going to wrap up our 2-day symposium with a set of 5-minute lightning talks from members of the RISC Leadership Network, talking about different research and outreach projects that we are currently working on. We're going to start off with Annette Evans, who is a postdoc at the University of Massachusetts Amherst and also a fellow of the USGS Northeast Climate Adaptation Science Center. So please take it away, Annette.
Great. Can you hear me and see my slides? Perfect. So I am going to start my timer and whiz through this really exciting new project that some of us at Northeast RISC are working on, looking at how biocontrol might be impacted by our changing climate. There we go. So this project, it actually grew out of feedback from last year's RISC Symposium. So this is why it's really important, and please and thank you for filling out our post-symposium survey. And so one of the questions last year that we had asked on that post-symposium survey was what kind of research or topics related to invasive species and climate change you as our community want to hear more about from our research team. And one of those topics that was identified was how climate change might impact the efficiency of biocontrol agents. And so in digging into what's out there in the literature already, there's a couple of different ways that climate change could impact the effectiveness of biocontrol, either by impacting the invasive hosts, so the invasive species themselves, or by impacting the biocontrol agents. And so I'm showing you a couple of examples of how that could happen. So we could see changes in the number of generations that an invasive species or biocontrol agent could go through, shifts in geographic distribution of either of those species, changes in disease dynamics, changes in survival. So we often hear about cold winter temperatures being a limiting factor, and that might be removed both for invasive species and for biocontrol agents. And then also changes in how synchronized a biocontrol agent is with its invasive host. And then as we were sort of digging a little further into the literature, there's some really amazing and wonderful studies that have come out over the past couple of years looking at some of these challenges and management implications. But often these studies take more of a colloquial approach where they'll sort of demonstrate examples of some of those mechanisms I showed you on the previous slide. But we found it really hard to see how much actual empirical evidence there is out there already for how climate change might be impacting biocontrol agents. And so we're hoping to tackle this by gathering up what evidence there currently is out there in the literature for how climate change might be impacting biocontrol agent efficacy, and then also trying to dig in a little bit into how climate change might be impacting the effectiveness of biocontrol. So are changes in biocontrol mostly driven by climate impacts on invasive hosts? Are they mostly driven by climate impacts on the biocontrol agents themselves, or is it changes in both of those host and agents that are driving shifts? So to do this, last summer, our team started a systematic review of just what literature is out there. So we searched keywords relating to biocontrol and climate change and Web of Science, and this returned around 2,000 articles. Our team went through those articles and threw out ones that didn't really fit this climate change impact scenario, and this left us with around 168. And these articles were ones that had manipulated some kind of an environmental variable and measured a response in a biocontrol agent. So this is ongoing, so I'm just going to show you a little bit of what those studies showed us. So the majority of those 168 studies were done in a really controlled setting, so either in a lab or a greenhouse. So this is great, but in the future, it'd be also great to sort of expand this work to understand how much of these changes we're also seeing out in natural ecosystems. We also saw that while the pie chart at the bottom, while there's a wide variety of environmental variables being tested, most studies look at temperature as a response variable. But as we know, there's a whole variety of ways that climate change is likely to shift environmental conditions. And what was also interesting is 75% of those studies just looked at the impact of one environmental variable on its own. So we don't have a great understanding about how, say, temperature and moisture, for example, might interact to affect biocontrol efficiency. So that's a current research gap. When we look at the kind of biocontrol agents that are being tested, so we're seeing a lot of studies on the responses of arthropods as a biocontrol agent. And this is likely just reflective of the kind of landscape the kinds of biocontrol agents that are being implemented. And then when we look at the kinds of mechanisms that are being evaluated, so most studies look at parasitoids, so 37%, followed by predators and herbivores. And then just to finish up, I want to give you a taste of the kinds of responses. So there's a whole wide variety of responses that studies look at, both for the invasive species, which is the top pie chart, and biocontrol agents at the bottom. So for invasive species, most papers are looking at survival, and biocontrol agents, most of the responses are looking at climate change impact on reproduction, feeding, and parasitism rates and survival. And so our next step are to dig into the 59 papers that tested the responses of both the biocontrol agent and the invasive host simultaneously, to try to tease apart potential climate change impacts on both. So I'd love to connect with you if you've got suggestions or questions about this work, and that's my 5 minutes.
Thanks, Annette. That was awesome. And I forgot to mention that hopefully we'll have a few minutes at the end of this session. We're going to hold questions, but feel free to type anything into the chat. And hopefully we'll have a few minutes to do some Q&A with all of our speakers. But I'm going to move right along since we're in a lightning session and introduce Allie Putnam, who is a PhD candidate in organismic and evolutionary biology at the University of Massachusetts. Take it away, Allie.
Thanks. Hopefully everyone can see my screen.
Yep.
Here comes the lightning. Hello, my name is Allie Putnam, and I'm a 4th-year PhD candidate at UMass Amherst. I'm a marine ecologist and a member of the NE RISCC leadership team. Today, I'm going to briefly talk about a research project with RISCC involving the impact assessment of marine species that may be in potential range shift. In a marine setting, range shifts or range expansions relate to the movement of species along shore, waterways, and oceanic current, and are both a response to global climate change and a driver of global change as they enter into regions where they previously have not occupied. Both native and introduced species may respond to climate change through range shifts where the environment has changed to suit and support their physiological needs. An example of this here on the East Coast is the invasive striped barnacle, which was introduced to the mid-Atlantic coast, but has been expanding northward and has been found in the Long Island Sound and most recently Narragansett, Rhode Island. And the red-spotted anemone, a native southern species that has been expanding into the Chesapeake Bay region and has been found in Long Island Sound on docks. And most recently, I have found and been monitoring a population in the rocky intertidal of Jamestown, Rhode Island. What might happen to the environment and local ecological community as new species move into the area? We hope to determine and forecast potential impacts that may occur through the use of the ICAT impact assessment. So what is an impact assessment and what do we hope to learn? An impact assessment provides information on the severity and type of environmental impacts a species being evaluated has on other environments, be it its habitat of origin or from areas where it's already been introduced. We are using a modified version of the Environmental Impact Classification for Alien Taxa, or ICAT, modified and described yesterday by our plenary speaker, Cascade Sorty and colleagues, where an evaluated species undergoes a systematic literature search and negative or positive ecological or environmental impacts will be assessed and scored on a scale of 1 to 5. Historically, ICAT has only reviewed negative impacts such as predation, competition, biofouling, etc., but recently there has been more focus to include positive impacts a species might have, such as habitat amelioration or food resource. We're evaluating species that are currently in or may eventually be in range expansion through the Gulf of Maine. Briefly, the magnitude ranking system of ICAT includes a 1 to 5 scale associated with specific changes by the species in assessment. Lower scores 1 and 2 include changes to native individuals' behavior or fitness, but no changes to species population. Mid-level scores 3 document changes to native population, but not community composition. Higher scores 4 and 5 demonstrate impacts that has caused changes in native species, spatial occupancy, community composition, and/or extinction. The species considered for this assessment come from a database developed through the USGS NRPP Boston Harbor Islands Biodiversity Project, where species currently documented as invasive to Boston Harbor and the Gulf of Maine were consolidated, along with the creation of a watch list of native and invasive species south of the Gulf of Maine with potential for range expansion. We are assessing invertebrates and algae that are both native and introduced on the southern edge and below the Gulf of Maine that may be range expanding. Some examples are bryozoans such as Bugulina stolonifera, shrimp such as Palaemon macrodactylus, and seaweed such as Sargassum muticum. Here I'm showing you an impact assessment example for one of the species on our list, the Atlantic ghost crab. 201 papers were screened for inclusion, with only 14 papers retained and evaluated. Each line is a study that has documented some form of impact. Of all the literature included, the assessment with the highest impact score for this species was 2 or minor. An example of this is the highlighted box here. This study shows daily survival rates of piping plover nests to be lower with ghost crabs present than nests without ghost crabs, suggesting possible predation by the ghost crab. However, their results did not show changes in the piping plover population, so received a lower score of 2 or minor. Several species have been evaluated to date, and this is an ongoing project. An example of a high impact species is the fiddler crab Manuka pugnax, which is currently being studied for range expansion by UMass's Jordana Barley, whose positive impact is bioturbation to sandy soils, which promote population growth and spatial occupancy of cordgrass through oxygenation. Interestingly, of our 46 species to assess, already 10 have been evaluated to find no data in terms of impacts to ecological and environmental systems. These species need further ecological studies conducted. Finally, this research is not necessarily to tell management what to do in their management practices, but to give supporting information for managers and practitioners to make informed decisions on their practices. Lynch et al. Recently published Managing for Radical Ecosystem Change, Applying the Resist, Accept, Direct RAD framework, where managers can make informed and purposeful choices about how to respond to ecological change, such as that by introduced and range expanding species, by resisting, accepting, or directing. We intend for the results of this work to be used as supporting evidence for decision-making in this framework. Thanks, and I just want to acknowledge all the folks who are working on this project.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Alia. That was great. Okay, moving right along. We're going to move to a talk by Dan Bonaiuto. He's a postdoctoral research associate at the University of Massachusetts, and we'll be talking about some new research. Take it away, Dan.
Can everyone hear me all right? Okay, great. So everyone, I'm speaking today kind of on behalf of the full spatial ecology lab in Bethany Bradley's group at UMass Amherst, and we are undertaking a lab project to really try to understand how evolutionary history can help us potentially screen new invaders. So just by way of background, as you all know, some introduced species can become invasive and have negative ecological, economic, or public health impacts. But also many introduced species do not become invasive and have neutral, or dare I say, even positive ecological and economic impacts. So what a good regulatory process needs to do is balance the risk and reward of introducing into the international plant trade and new introductions. And one of the main tools we have to do that is a process called a weed risk assessment, at least in plants. And what you can essentially, what these look like are a series of questions or a checklist. They're usually yes or no. And for every yes, you get a certain point, and above a threshold, you being a plant will be classified as invasive and then regulated, and below a threshold will be permitted for distribution. So I think about these a little bit as if like a net. We're trying to find questions that will screen the invaders, but not produce too much bycatch. So not so not screen out some potential non-invasives that could be useful or at least not harmful. So because these weed risk assessments vary in their ability to do that, some researchers have really questioned their utility. And what we're thinking about is really making sure that these evaluative questions on these weed risk assessments are really based on a sound understanding of the science. So many weed risk assessments have questions about the invasiveness of close relatives to the focal species as a predictor. So we decided to ask the question, right? Are invasive species more closely related clusters within the larger established non-native species pool? And despite there being a long history of interest in the evolution of invasiveness, the question has not been broadly formulated this way. And then we also wanted to ask, does this vary by geographic scale? So briefly, we used a phylogenetic or a clustering index called an inverse nearest taxon index. And I won't go into the details, but the main thing you need to know is that negative values indicate more relatedness structure, more clustering, whereas 0 values would say that there is no difference from random. So first we looked at this as the global scale for the sort of 9 global continental regions. 8 out of 9 of them, all except Antarctica, showed significant clustering. We then drilled down to the lower 48. And again, we found that in all regions, and these regions just in the top map are defined by the US Fish and Wildlife Service's administrative regions. In all of these regions, we still find phylogenetic clustering, or the relatedness of invasive species is strong, and we can see that is strongest in the Southwest, weakest in the Northeast, or sorry, weakest in the Southeast, and kind of where we're perhaps most interested in the Northeast, it's moderate. And you can see that these patterns vary a little bit by state, but the general regional patterns maintain. So thinking about kind of why we might see some of this variation, we decided to plot or regress these estimations of phylogenetic clustering on the y-axis against some common temperature and precipitation and climate variables that are often thought to limit plant ranges. And what we see is a general trend where there is more phylogenetic or relatedness clustering with colder and drier regions, right? Because of this negative slope. Again, our negative values on the y-axis indicate more clustering. So the takeaway to think about, right? It turns out that the evolutionary relatedness is a pretty good predictor of potential invasiveness, and that is maintained across geographic scales. This is especially true in colder or drier regions, and which is, to highlight when thinking about climate change, that because of this climate dependency, climate change may alter these realized patterns of phylogenetic relatedness. So thinking about that, the idea that the utility of this particular category may shift over time. And I'm happy to answer any questions, and this is ongoing work as well. There will be more to come, so thanks for your time.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Dan. That was fantastic. And moving right along again, I'm really pleased to introduce Matt Furtakos, who will be talking about some of his doctoral research at the University of Massachusetts. Take it away, Matt.
Hi, everyone. So yeah, I'm just going to give a brief introduction into some of my dissertation research, which is looking at creating a climate-smart horticultural industry. So outside of accidental introductions through seed contamination and ballast water, most invasive plants in the United States were introduced intentionally, as displayed here. Over half of these intentional introductions have been through the ornamental plant trade, which shows a significant role that this industry has had in the establishment of invasive plants. So on top of this, climate change is also intensifying the success of invasive plants introduced through this trade. So for example, climate extremes are increasing habitat disturbance events, which creates more opportunities for establishment. Invasives are also becoming more competitive with warming and higher atmospheric CO2. And projected climate warming in the northeastern region threatens the viability of the current nursery stock that we have today. And this will soon necessitate a shift towards new warm adapted species. Unfortunately, as the industry responds to these changes, they risk introducing new non-native species of warmer adapted plants that could spread to natural areas and become invasive. So that is displayed in this figure here. The hatched red portion is where Mahonia bielae is currently invasive, and this lighter red portion above it shows where future invasion risk is possible for this species, and then the black triangles are nurseries that actually currently sell this species. So this kind of shows how through the facilitation of these nurseries, hobby gardeners could unwittingly serve as a vector of invasive plant establishment in the future. But the good news is a recent risk survey has shown that nursery professionals have a willingness to change their inventories if they're supplied information about invasive plants and what could be coming in the future or become a problem in the future. So my research aims to take advantage of this willingness by identifying native alternatives to non-native plants currently sold in the ornamental plant trade to supply to the industry. And this work is being completed by assembling two different databases, one of the taxa sold in historical nursery sales and one documenting taxa sold in modern nursery sales for comparison. So the historical data set was created using metadata from digitized seed and nursery catalogs in the Biodiversity Heritage Library's Seed and Nursery Catalog collection, and in Restoring American Gardens, which is an encyclopedia of heirloom ornamental plants. And the data set contains over 2.4 million offerings at about 2,800 locations in the United States, of about 19,000 unique taxa spanning the years 1719 to 1978. And you can see that a majority of the offerings are in the eastern United States, and specifically the Northeast. And also for the date ranges, they're mostly concentrated between about 1890 and 1950. So what we found from this historical data set is that despite a more diverse array of native taxa across our database, introduced species are offered for sale across catalogs much more often. And as a result, there are likely many native species in the historical database that could be used to replace the introduced species being sold today. So now for the modern nursery database, which is ongoing work that we're working on assembling, and I'm doing this work with the help of two undergraduate students, Trista Dierstein at UMass Amherst and Sue V. Birch from the University of Arizona. And so far, we've reached out to about 1,400 nurseries by email and have obtained about 400 inventory lists. And we've assembled this database into about 220,000 offerings, which we're now working on doing the data cleaning for, and hopefully we can assemble that soon to do a comparison to the historical work. And you can see that this is mostly focused in the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic regions. And the states where the data is located is shown here. So ultimately, the goal is to help home gardeners create climate smart gardens with native alternatives that can survive the future conditions brought on by climate change as a result of this work. So once we have a list of candidate native species, we'll use existing propagation and plant growth guides to identify species that are easy to grow, adapted to current and future temperatures in the Northeast, and collectively encompass a range of habitat types from both the current and historical databases. By identifying and offering native alternatives, we're hoping that the facilitation of the spread of harmful invasives through the ornamental plant trade from further south to northeast can be suppressed. Thank you. Feel free to contact me anytime.
Thank you, Matt. That was really great. I love all the photos too. Yeah, like Bethany noted in the chat, requests for the paper or the database. These are all ongoing pieces of work that everyone is actively working on. So it's kind of a sneak preview of what we're working on for research. And so that's great. Stay tuned. So for the last lightning talk, we'll pivot slightly from original research to Toni Lynn Morelli, who is a research ecologist at the USGS Northeast Climate Adaptation Science Center. She's going to be talking about range expansion of risks. Take it away.
Yes, get all the puns in there. We only have a few more minutes. Hi, everybody. Thanks for hanging on to the end. I want to talk about how just like this pile of rocks got here from all of us working together. We are all doing this as a community and not alone. I work at the NECASC. I don't know if we've identified the CASC yet. So I'm just going to say there are 9 climate adaptation science centers around the country, and they are funded by USGS, but a partnership between USGS and a host consortium. And in the Northeast, that is a bunch of universities, institutions, and the host is UMass. So maybe you already knew that, but the kind of great work that's happening on invasives here is the kind of work we're doing in all kinds of areas. Okay, so I want to say that we are all here together doing this work because the invasive problem exacerbated by climate change can be totally overwhelming. And unlike what my 9-year-old thinks he can pull off here, we can't actually do this on our own. We have to work together to do it. And so what we're trying to do, not only in this region, but in other regions, is to do that as a team. And so you know by now who the Northeast RISC is, right? What we felt like is we had built something that was success. We felt like we had something here, something that was working. And so we kind of decided maybe others would want to pick up that idea as well. And they also were noticing. And we thought maybe we could help that process by writing down everything that we'd done. And so a couple of years ago, we came out with this guiding principles document, and it really was to say, here's how we did things. Maybe we didn't do everything right. Maybe we did some things wrong and some things great. And so we wanted to write it all down. So that is available on our website, like everything we talk about pretty much except this fresh research, I guess. And you can see where we had our like timeline of the things we've gone through to get here. And one of the reasons we wrote that down was we thought maybe some other regions want to take this up. And indeed they have. So here we are now in 2023, and there are now 5 RISCs in the US that have come up in the last couple of years. We are very excited to talk about all the other work that's happening. We are at each other's meetings, we share our lessons learned. They've started up in different ways than we have. Some things they're doing better than we ever did. We do so much sharing and cross-pollination that I feel really proud to be a part of this giant kind of network of networks. So if you're here from a different region or interested in learning about other regions, there's so much information out there. And so we all now share a website. You might have noticed we sneakily changed our website in the last year. So now RISC Network is everybody, and we're RISC Network Northeast/Northeast. We also sneakily changed our logo so that we all have the same logo now across the network with just a little regional tweaks. But we have interns that help us run this whole network of networks. We also have a NISC funded postdoc. So NISC is the National Invasive Species Council. And so we have Annette Evans, who just presented, working as a postdoc ORISE fellow for the whole network, doing research, but also kind of coordination. Super exciting stuff. And I just wanted to highlight just quickly a few things from each one of those networks to show you. So for example, they're also doing management challenges. So here's the Northwest RISC, it's on EAB, so you might be interested. They had a webinar where they brought over some of our experts to their backyard to host a webinar just like we do. You can see one here from the North Central as well. They do research summaries. Here's one from the Southeastern US. They do webinars just like us. Here's one that was very highly attended from the Pacific RISC, and you can see there the logo that's like ours. And so finally, I wanted to note that we also are spreading internationally. So we have a lot of Canadian colleagues here, some of the Canadian colleagues that are building this NISC, the National Invasive Species and Climate Change Network. And so we've helped do some sharing about how to get the network up and running. And so that should be, I think, happening this year. So you can see some notes there. They're looking for potential interested people. There's a contact there. And so it's just fantastic because we can all just share across borders. And as a result of this, we got a big award from the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies in the US the Climate Adaptation Leadership Award for Broad Partnership. And that's all because of the work that we're all doing together here at RISC in the Northeast and around the continent now. So just very happy to be here, to have you all here, and to be sharing these moments again as we go into our 7th year of RISC in the Northeast. And I'll pass it back to Audrey.
Great. Thank you so much, Tony Lynn, and to all of our lightning talk speakers. I think we have, Jenica doesn't need a huge amount of time for closing remarks, so we do have time for a couple of questions. I see one scrolling up here. Julia Richburg, I think this is a question for Matt. Wondering if for the list of native alternatives, are you filtering out or flagging ones that are on state endangered species lists, because those might not be the best for propagating widely?
Right. When we go through the literature, I think that's going to definitely be one of the factors we look into and filter out those species. Definitely.
Great. Yeah, any other burning questions for our lightning speakers? Certainly, thanks to Emily and everyone throughout the day who've been listing resources in the chat. We will save that chat so we can keep that, because there's a really great record of conversation and resources in there. Okay. So thank you for these great talks for the last 2 days. Thanks for everyone who's come, and I'm going to turn it to Jenica to wrap things up.
Give us a quick wrap up for the last few days. As a reminder, we put together these lovely little summaries every year of what RISC has accomplished. And Bethany talked about a lot of these activities in her opening remarks. And so I'll just point you to the symposium. So last year we had 240 Zoom attendees. And when we created this graphic, we had 120 people registered. The reality is we almost broke Zoom right before the symposium because we went over our registration limit of 500 people. So I'll just say kudos to you for making us scramble with technology at the last minute. That's a really great problem to have. And thankfully, we've got some tech people that can solve it. And you've also seen this mission statement multiple times. And so I'm not going to read it to you again, but I do want to highlight why we hold the symposium. So we do this because we're trying to have an efficient information sharing mechanism. This helps us to identify information gaps. So when we share from the research community to the practitioner community and practitioner community back to the research community, we really start to gain an understanding of what we know and what we don't know. And frankly, it helps us to build this community of diverse professionals. It really takes all of our expertise to tackle this big, complicated problem that is invasive species and climate change. And this is actually what our network looked like as of the symposium last year. And so I'm excited to see what the breakdown looks like this year. But what really strikes me is that we have this grouping or diverse grouping of professional backgrounds. So we have researchers that are in the room. We have our natural resource managers that are in the room. We have extension and education folks, and then we have a whole bunch of other people too. And so really it's this coming together of all of these different perspectives that makes RISC as valuable as it is. And our leadership team is also diversifying, which is something we've been working towards for a number of years. So we've had 6 practitioners join our leadership team since 2021, so a little over a year now. And so if that's something that you're interested in, whether you're a researcher or a practitioner, I encourage you to reach out to us to discuss kind of what's involved with that. But we really do try to keep an open door policy to invite people into that group to really move all of these projects along that you've been hearing about and organizing events like this, like the symposium. And one of the reasons that we keep showing up and organizing this symposium is because you all tell us it's worthwhile. So I'm not sure as a scientist I've ever gotten complete agreement on anything ever. So this is a really odd but heartening response to see in a survey, that you all think that this is something that's worth doing. And I'll just say we send surveys and we also look at them and we respond to them. So last year, you provided us with a bunch of ideas of what you wanted more of. And so this is just a short list of some of those things that we were able to incorporate into this year's symposium. So we had more state agency folks and practitioners that are managing land and water resources. We had more marine and freshwater topics throughout the couple days. We had a session that incorporated cultural views as an inherent part of the process and projects. We had a session on assisted migration or managed relocation and so on. So keep telling us what you want, because that helps us figure out what to do next. And so I have this tricky job of trying to share kind of my first impressions of the last couple days. And I'm hoping that this is a conversation that we'll keep having as a group. But things that stuck out to me were that there are lots of innovations in detection and management that are out there. So I've been trying to do screen grabs throughout the day to give us some visuals. If I'm honest, I might have a real sweet spot for these detector dogs. They're pretty darn cute and pretty amazing. But really all of these technologies are moving us forward in being able to detect the next up and coming invaders in our region. We're also progressing in understanding impacts and changing impacts. So whether it's carbon storage or damage estimates, so dollars lost due to damage, understanding what the species are that we need to be worrying about, whether our biocontrols will remain efficacious with climate change. These are all things that we're starting to get a handle on in the Northeast. And this is something that I've been thinking personally about for the last couple years, which is really that invasives and natives and everything in between, so the neonatives and the sleeper species, they're not necessarily separate things. They're species that behave in certain ways. And we kind of heard that message echoed throughout a couple different talks. Our keynote speaker, we heard a little bit about that with the habitat resiliency panel in terms of talking about competing restoration goals or aims. Heard about that in our assisted migration or managed relocation panel. And so that's something I'm going to keep thinking about and keep trying to articulate and come up with frameworks and ways that we can think about it and utilize it in our work around invasive species and climate change, or moving species and climate change is maybe the label I want to start putting on it. I was also really struck at how important community connections can be. So we were fortunate that we were able to award Bobby Wilson the Community Action Award. We had a talk about tribal engagement and ash and emerald ash borer, and how important those community connections were to making that project meaningful and even doable from the start. So I would encourage all of us to think about ways that we can connect with whatever communities are relevant to the species or the habitats that we're working in. I was also really struck by something that Tyler said about the importance of listening. And it really made me think about the translational invasion ecology process that we try to embody here at RISC, which is meeting to listen, to discuss needs and goals, and to identify solutions. And so, yes, part of that is discussion, but part of it is just sitting back and listening. And that has been part of what I've taken out of the last couple of days, is being able to just absorb and then process. And I blanked out people's names because I didn't ask them if it was okay if I could do this. But we had networking in action in the chat. Literally, there were people like, yes, let's get together. Here's my email. this is exactly what we hope happens at these symposia and at all of our events. So this just like, I wanted to put the big heart emoji on this when I saw it. And for those of you that aren't on our listserv, I suspect many are, our website is listed here, and these are the basic instructions you'll find on the website to join the listserv so that you're in the loop about everything that's happening with RISC. And so this is where I want to ask everybody to take a moment, and if you're comfortable, turn on your camera and give ourselves a round of applause.
You have to stop sharing, Jenica.
Oh, darn it. Okay, hold on.
And everybody can unmute too. This is the moment.
Yes.
You can unmute as soon as
Stop share. There we go. Once Jenica masters the technology. So really, like, we are here and we are what we are because of you. So thank you, thank you, thank you. And we just took your picture. So this will be you next year. All right. Now let's see if I can make this share again. We're almost there. Of course not. Are you seeing my screen? Yes.
You're good. We can see it.
All right, perfect. Good. And so I just wanted to give sort of one more shout out. Northeast RISC is awesome because of all of you, and it's so awesome that there are now other RISCs. So kudos to you for being the trailblazers in sort of being the model for how this can work. So last but not least, I have to thank the team that went into this. So you've heard from a number of people throughout the day as moderators. You've seen us in the chat. So our symposium planning team, so you've seen myself, you've seen Carrie Marshner, Audrey Barker-Plotkin, Marissa Weiss, and Justin Deleva, who has largely not been on camera, but has really been like the orchestrator behind the scenes. So thank you to our symposium planning team, and thank you to the whole leadership team for helping to, develop ideas for this symposium and also facilitate and manage the whole meeting. As you might expect, there's a lot that goes into managing, a couple hundred, 250 people online at the same time. So thank you to this whole group of people for making it happen. And finally, thank you all for coming. You know where to find us. If you're tech savvy, you can scan this QR code and fill out the survey right now to tell us how awesome it was or to tell us what we can do better. There is also going to be a link in the chat to the post-event survey, and we'll also email you. So don't worry, you will have the survey, but we really would appreciate your feedback on the meeting. And so with that, that's a wrap for 2023. Thank you, everybody.